How could one of the largest economies in the entire world suddenly need the support of its biggest competition? What led to China experiencing staggering growth and seeking to engage with the US? And could ironing out their rocky relationship even be of benefit to either country and their economies? Well, we're about to find out. Welcome to the Infographic Show, and join us as we do our best to determine the real reason that China might desperately need the United States again. From late 2019 all the way through 2020, and with many of its effects still being felt today, the entire world was rocked by the COVID-19 pandemic. Many schools and businesses needed to implement social distancing measures in order to reduce the spread of the respiratory virus, and in some countries, nationwide lockdowns became a regular occurrence. The pandemic had a considerable economic impact on every major country across the globe. The fallout of so many businesses closing their doors in order to prevent the spread of COVID-19, as well as restrictions on importing and exporting goods, meant that for many countries less money was going into their economies while plenty was going out. This led to significant financial fallout the world over, which some economies are only just starting to recover from. But over in China, that recovery seems to have been unexpectedly hindered. For a time, China's economy looked to be doing relatively well, getting better post-COVID at a rate that was actually exceeding the Chinese government's expectations. Although the country's consumers were avoiding larger purchases like new cars or apartments, and a number of Chinese factories were running at lower capacity than usual, their exports were recovering and in some cases actually getting stronger. Since exports are one of the major, if not the most important pillars holding up China's economy, free-flowing global trade is crucial for the economic well-being of the nation. Some of their biggest international buyers are the United States, Hong Kong, Japan, and Germany. Over the past decade, China's exports have steadily grown, with the exception of 2009. During that year, the global financial crisis and an economic downturn across the world caused trade to slow down in most countries. Additionally, 2016 was another year that saw notable decreases in global demand for products exported from China. As well as being the most heavily populated country on the planet, China is also both the largest manufacturing economy and the largest exporter in the world. This means that anything that hurts global trade inevitably has some kind of negative impact on China. Earlier in 2023, a few months before we made this video, China was getting back on its feet, at least economically speaking. The construction of new housing was on the rise, and although that had slowed down slightly, there was still plenty of investments being made into the infrastructure and manufacturing sectors. This wave of economic activity started in December of 2022, when the Chinese government lifted their zero-COVID measures, which had enforced a number of industry shutdowns and mass testing for the coronavirus. While intended to monitor and potentially slow the spread of COVID-19, these precautions had the side effect of also slowing down something else: the growth of China's economy. During the fourth quarter of 2022, the country saw a worrying uptick in cases of COVID-19, which caused growth to drop just short of 3%. After the zero-COVID measures were lifted, this growth went up by 4.5% between January and March of 2023 when compared to the figures from the same months during the previous year. This growth was largely driven by consumers gaining purchasing confidence, spending money, and thus fueling the economy. So why is all of this important? China plays a crucial role on the global economic stage. It's the second largest economy in the entire world, with only the United States ranked above it. China's gross domestic product, the value of all the goods produced and all the services provided during a single year, was almost $18 trillion. Considering this is around 17 to 20% of the global GDP, if China experiences an economic downturn, that shock will almost certainly impact every other nation in the world. China is also part of the economic group BRICS, which also includes Brazil, Russia, India, and South Africa. BRICS is a complicated topic in and of itself, but for the purposes of this video, you just need to know that in 2022, China outranked all other BRICS member countries in terms of GDP. However, despite this, 2022 was still considered to be one of the country's worst economic performances in years. Given the size of its economy and the rate at which it has grown, China has been one of, if not the single driving forces behind economic growth for the entire world. And that's what makes it so important, and why a sudden, unexpected slowdown in their recovery from COVID's economic aftermath should be a cause for concern for other countries, especially those that trade with China. That being said, we're living in a time where there are constant tensions between various nations across the world, and as those continue simmering, they can occasionally boil over and cause disagreements to occur. Despite perhaps not always seeing eye to eye on everything, nations like the United States and many throughout Europe maintain an interdependent relationship between their economies and China's. Although there was a warning that a painful economic slowdown was on the horizon, the country's GDP during 2022 indicated that the second-largest economy in the world was coming back with a vengeance and shaking off the struggles of the pandemic. China had already taken a number of steps intended to stimulate some rapid growth in its economy. One of the most important investments China has made so far has been in its infrastructure, laying the groundworks for high-speed rail lines to connect the colossal nation, as well as building new highways and bridges. You might think at first that investing all that money in infrastructure wouldn't lead to massive economic growth, and that's partly true, but providing easy access to travel routes can allow workers to arrive at their jobs faster, thus making them more efficient. The more efficient, the more profit a company makes, in theory, and the more that money can contribute to the overall economy. It also serves to make the country's logistics smoother in general, allowing the transport of goods to move at a faster pace. And that's not even mentioning the jobs that can be created by investing in infrastructure. After all, a highway or a high-speed train won't build itself. You need engineers, planners, and construction workers in order to achieve those goals. All of these factors contribute to growing the economy. Additionally, China's primary bank, the People's Bank of China, announced to commercial banks that they were permitted to hold slightly smaller reserves against possible losses, which freed these banks up to lend more to people seeking loans. The effects of these economic policies were also felt on a smaller scale. When it came to traveling or frequenting restaurants, public spending was on the rise. Some hotels were forced to shut down their elevators to save money amidst the losses they'd made during the pandemic. Now, these same establishments, which only saw occasional diners in their restaurants, were now receiving hundreds of customers, with lines of people waiting for a table trailing out the door. However, these hints that the economy was stabilizing were perhaps misleading. There was an increase in consumer spending, but it was uneven. One butcher at a street market in Suzhou noticed that his customers were still being frugal, staying highly selective about where and how they spent their money. Frugality is of course a person's right and down to their own discretion, but this particular vendor, a small business owner, noticed the impact it was having on his sales. However, a catfish vendor within the same Suzhou market had a different experience. As he often sold his wares to local restaurants, his business significantly slowed down during the pandemic when local restaurants shut down. Then, once restrictions were lifted, the same clients he'd sold to previously were placing large orders once again. Those two different examples taken from businesses within the same marketplace are basically a microcosm for what's been going on with China's economy when it comes to how consumers are spending their money. Money is still changing hands and flowing through the economy, but it's not happening everywhere. China's economy is getting stronger, but unevenly. Some sectors contributing to the Chinese economy haven't even started to fully recover yet. Another industry that was hit hard by having to shut its doors during the pandemic was movie theaters. Despite the increasing yet uneven level of consumer spending in areas like food, a whole third of China's movie theaters are yet to reopen. Countrywide box office revenue was down by a staggering 55% in March of 2023. Needless to say, things still aren't running smoothly. It isn't all bad though. Much of the rest of the world is finding the economic fallout of COVID is coming in the form of inflation, in large part thanks to governments injecting money into their economies during the pandemic in a nearsighted attempt to stop them from crashing. But over in China, there's actually very little signs of inflation. One of the more commonplace strategies during the pandemic in Western countries was to send relief checks or coupons to households of essential workers in order to bolster their income while they still had to work during the rise in COVID cases. In China, this wasn't the case, meaning there was a limit to how much companies could raise the prices of their goods as there was less money to go around. Of course, part of the reason for the continued frugality and uneven spending among the population is largely down to how the pandemic affected people's incomes. Millions of working people in China had their incomes severely depressed, and the amount they currently make still hasn't caught up to pre-pandemic levels. In February of 2023, unemployment of people between the ages of 16 and 24 was just over 18%. Within a month, it had already climbed more than another 1.5%. Fortunately, this isn't the case for other demographics, with unemployment between those aged 25 to 59 dropping down to 4.3% in March of 2023, down from 4.8% in February. In addition, factories are also attempting to work their way through the backlog created by having to shut their doors during the pandemic. The output of factories, mines, and power plants all contribute to China's overall industrial sector, and production was able to significantly rise in early 2023 as these businesses attempted to meet the demand for their goods. However, the demand for these goods didn't just disappear during the height of COVID. A lot of the country's industrial production centers around the products it exports internationally. The industrial sector is in a delicate balance of attempting to quickly recover from the effects of the pandemic, while also having to try to catch up on a backlog of orders for parts and goods that it built up while the zero-COVID lockdowns were in place. One of the largest sectors experiencing a sharp slowdown because of this is China's automotive industry. Car sales dropped over 13% in the first quarter of 2023, also being hindered by the government reinstating an added sales tax on the sales of gas-powered cars, likely implemented to encourage people to turn to electric alternatives. Now, all these factors have led the pace of China's economy to slow right back down. In spring of 2023, the annual pace of economic growth dropped to a little over 3%, which, as you can imagine, the Chinese government wasn't all that pleased about. It falls short of their target for restabilizing their economy. This all begs the question, just what does the United States have to do with all this? Well, the current falter in their economy has encouraged senior Chinese officials to engage in talks with other nations, even those often considered to be their geopolitical rivals. The United States and China are the two largest economies in the world, and together account for around 40% of all global economic output. Naturally, they've been rivals for quite some time, and yet they are also largely dependent upon each other for trade that brings money into both of their economies. Despite not always being on the best terms, with both attempting to sever their dependence on one another, the two have continued to engage with each other on an international economic level. Now, though, China has seemingly changed its tone toward the United States. The climate envoy for President Joe Biden, John Kerry, and Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen were both invited to Beijing on separate occasions for diplomatic meetings with high-ranking Chinese officials. Similarly, ministers from China are expected to travel to Washington, D.C. in order to conduct further talks on issues like climate change and trade. Seeking to announce to the world that China is open for business, and in order to stoke up its economy, the country's premier and second highest official met with some of the country's biggest tech companies to encourage them to hire more workers, with an emphasis on stirring up more economic growth. There's been an ongoing push by the Chinese government to try and assert greater political control over its tech industry, prompting many Chinese professionals in the field to emigrate. Whereas China's foreign policy has historically held more animosity, this softening in their approach, especially toward the United States, brings with it security concerns. While the more lax policy and friendlier diplomatic relations between the two could lead to the positive change China is seeking for its economy, their previous relationship could be what makes the U.S. reluctant to accept the proverbial olive branch. Recently, China enacted policies that would undermine its role within the global supply chain, affecting other companies that rely on them for trade. They declared intentions to limit the export of certain rare materials used in the production of semiconductors. This was widely believed to have been done in retaliation against the United States after they limited the sale of their exports of said advanced semiconductors to China. As much as it's possible that China's recent economic struggles might soften their approach to foreign relations and mutual agreements that could put them back on track towards stable economic growth, there's no guarantee. US-based companies have often complained about how much harder it's become to conduct business in China. Their government has placed a strong focus on their national security, leading to Chinese authorities conducting raids on American companies, even sometimes going as far as detaining personnel. The geopolitical landscape of the world plays a huge role in the decision-making of companies and their investors. Given the state of its economy and the uncertainty over how well it'll work with America, many companies have to choose whether they funnel money into China's economy and if they can continue to rely on it for exports. It's difficult to say whether China's appeal to the U.S. will pay off. It's no secret that the United States has felt threatened by China's growth, and whether or not this would impede their supporting efforts to help restabilize China's economy. The United States isn't known to budge, meaning they're unlikely to change their policies that have been targeting China's technology advances in order to slow them down. This unwillingness to relent gives China very little incentive to make compromises, regardless of their own ongoing economic issues. Not to mention, the US, like many other parts of the world, is also still trying to recover from the financial impact of the pandemic too, given how far-reaching its consequences were. There is a lot at stake for China, economically speaking. There are millions of jobs within the country that rely heavily on continued global trade and selling goods to other countries. As the world's largest trading nation, it falls to China to ensure that they're allowing the systems of global trade to continue to work. However, even if they are trying to play nice with the United States, there's always the concern that the US won't want to reciprocate. The date is July 2019, and rumors of a military buildup of Chinese forces across the strait from Taiwan begin to leak to the international press. As the 4th of July is celebrated here at home, thousands of miles away, Taiwan begins to move their command and control functions into hardened nuclear-proof underground facilities. F-16s and other strike aircraft are moved into mountain bases, and dummy missile batteries and anti-aircraft platforms are set up around the island of Taiwan. August rolls around, and by now it's clear to the world that China is indeed massing what looks like an invasion force on its side of the Taiwan Strait. Though the Chinese leader Xi Jinping reassures the world that he's only interested in a peaceful reunification of Taiwan and the mainland. The American military is put at DEFCON 3, which signals the Air Force to be ready to mobilize for a potential nuclear conflict in just 15 minutes. As September comes, the Chinese military has begun commandeering civilian ships in order to help move its 1 million man strong invasion force across the channel. The Chinese military lacks the amphibious capability to move more than a few thousand troops at a time. But in order to face 100,000 Taiwanese defenders and their 2 million reservists, the People's Liberation Army will need every available ship it can get its hands on, no matter how big or small. Across the strait, Taiwan has begun littering the only 13 beaches that an invasion force could be landed on with mines, razor wire, and other horrific surprises. The U.S. Pacific Fleet is fully mobilized by now, and the United States is at DEFCON 2. All military leave is canceled, and Marines board transports as they head for bases in Australia, Japan, and Guam. PACOM's carrier groups disperse 1,000 miles offshore from Taiwan, careful to make sure that they do not stray too deep into the net of ballistic missile coverage that China uses to threaten American naval vessels. There's no hiding China's intentions now. An invasion of Taiwan is coming, and the entire world knows it. Taiwanese troops, supplemented by a few thousand rapid response American forces, dig in for what will be the largest amphibious assault in history. The date is October 3, 2019. The seas between Taiwan and China are finally calm again, presenting a narrow 4-week opportunity for an amphibious assault that only reoccurs briefly one other time of the year, in May. Chinese troops are rushed to waiting transports. The lucky ones board military amphibious landing craft, while the unlucky ones must make the treacherous crossing on civilian boats with little if any protection. Overhead, hundreds of missiles fly out over the strait, slamming into radar, communications, and control nodes all over the island. Airfields are cratered. Civilian power plants are destroyed. Chinese jets scream overhead en route to strike at Taiwanese tanks and artillery pieces, shortly after followed by Chinese bombers. Yet the Taiwanese Air Force has long been redeployed to underground facilities, and American-made F-16s flown by Taiwanese pilots rise up to meet the incoming Chinese planes. 1,000 miles away, U.S. carrier battle groups are given the green light to advance to forward positions just off the Taiwan coast, bringing a significant portion of America's naval air power. They alone are more than a match for the Chinese Air Force. Yet as they steam ahead, a rain of ballistic missiles falls upon the battle groups. Anti-missile defense systems intercept many, yet others manage to slip through and deal devastating blows against American supercarriers. In moments, thousands of American sailors are dead. And in the first 5 minutes of the war, more American servicemen have died than in all conflicts combined since Vietnam. By the end of the first month of fighting, American casualties will reach Vietnam War levels, with Chinese and Taiwanese casualties many times that number. By the end of 2019, the war will officially be the bloodiest conflict since World War II. But could such a war really happen? And if it did, could you actually be drafted to fight in it? The sad answer is yes. And in fact, American military planners consider the Taiwan-China situation to be one of the several flashpoints that would lead directly to a Third World War. China, for its part, has long claimed that it seeks only a peaceful reunification with the island nation. Yet, just in 2016, Xi Jinping stated, "We have the determination, the ability, and the preparedness to deal with Taiwanese independence. And if we do not deal with it, we will be overthrown." China views Taiwan's continued independence as more than the historical thorn in its side, but now rather as a direct threat to the mainland's continued communist leadership. This is because the island nation has only grown more prosperous and economically powerful over the decades, becoming the 19th largest economy in the world. Taiwan also directly employs many mainland Chinese citizens, either on the island itself or in off-site factories and offices run by Taiwanese businesses. The same cannot be said in large numbers of China's influence on Taiwan. Yet even more dangerous than Taiwan's prosperity is what Xi Jinping and Chinese leadership fear the most: its liberal democracy. Taiwan's liberal democratic values completely undermined China's own hardline nationalistic values. While China enforces strict censorship, Taiwan espouses the same liberal values that America does, and mainland Chinese have begun to take notice. Pro-democracy demonstrations continue to grow within China, and as Chinese citizens spend more time abroad both in Taiwan and Europe and America, they are starting to bring democratic values back home with them. For China, Taiwan's continued independence is a deathly threat that must one day be eliminated, and increasingly, it looks like plans to eliminate Taiwan's independence are to do so by force. Yet, if China were to launch a war against Taiwan, currently one of the likeliest conflicts that the US actively prepares for, then America would be treaty-bound to defend the island's democracy. This would pit the two largest economies and military powers in the world against each other, and while the US would inevitably come out slightly ahead of China, casualties on both sides would be staggering. To this end, America would immediately need to boost its active military forces. The first step in bolstering American forces would be an immediate call-up of all reservists. With 860,000 reservists, any draft notices would likely not come for a while. Yet, depending on the scale of the war and America's objectives, a draft may ultimately be inevitable. Currently, America has two objectives to achieve in any conflict with China. The first being the complete destruction of its air and naval forces, and the second being the toppling of its communist government. The total destruction of all Chinese naval and air forces are a non-negotiable objective, meaning that no matter how the war went, unless it somehow went extremely poorly for the US, there would be no negotiations for a ceasefire until this objective was met. The US would direct all of its efforts and resources at ensuring that no Chinese naval or air forces survive the conflict. And the reasoning is quite simple. China cannot hope to fight a second war if its Navy and Air Force is destroyed, and a lengthy rearmament period would take a decade or more, giving ample opportunity for the US and allies to rearm themselves. The removal of China's communist government is an ancillary objective, which would be carried out via precision strikes, covert operations, and psychological operations aimed at the Chinese citizenry. Given that a purely military removal of China's government would require a full-scale land invasion, the US is happy to wage a war and not meet this objective, or leave it in the hands of a civilian population riled up by aggressive psychological operations. In the first scenario, it's unlikely that a draft would be instigated by the US government, given the US's advantages in naval and air forces both. Though both the American Navy and Air Force would suffer significant losses in the effort, China would indubitably face the complete annihilation of its own Navy and Air Force to the Americans and their allies. In this case, reservists would likely be enough to bring American combat strength back to manageable levels, and a draft would be highly unlikely. Yet, if the scope of the conflict expanded for any reason, and a direct removal of China's communist government was the only road to peace, an American draft would be a necessity. With over 2 million active duty forces in the Chinese military, the US and its allies would need to bolster their own numbers significantly to even attempt an invasion of China. All male American citizens and immigrant non-citizens between the ages of 18 and 25 are required by law to register in the Selective Service System. In 2010, the SSS had over 16 million young American men on file, yet the US has a total fit-for-service manpower pool of over 111 million. With an increasingly bloody conflict against China, the SSS would without a doubt be activated, and full-rate conscription would begin for the first time since Vietnam. War with China is not likely, and yet it is considered the most realistic and probable flashpoint for the world's next major war. While the world has not seen any major powers go to war since the end of World War II, and it will hopefully not see them do so ever again, the reality is that several of any possible diplomatic missteps in the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait could lead to an unavoidable conflict between the US and China. And with the life of the Chinese Communist Party likely dependent on forcing Taiwan back into the fold and crushing the island's democratic government, the US may be headed straight for another military draft sooner than any of us could have hoped for. The People's Republic of China is huge. Not only is it the world's most populous country, with a population of around 1.404 billion people, it's massive land-wise. The country is approximately 3,700,000 square miles, making it slightly larger than the United States in land area. Although China spans 5 geographical time zones, the whole country follows a single standard time. China's home to 56 ethnic groups. Linguists estimate that there are nearly 300 living languages spoken in China, with Mandarin Chinese having the most speakers, around 955 million people. China is governed by the Communist Party of China, which administers the country from the capital of Beijing. The country is rapidly developing and is on track to become a superpower. Here are 6 places China is attempting to subjugate to expand its borders, economic, and global influence. Number 1. Tibet. China has a long and volatile relationship with Tibet, beginning in the 13th century and throughout different periods in history. Tibet has been ruled by Chinese and Mongolian dynasties and has also been an independent nation. In the first quarter of the 20th century, Tibet was ruled by Great Britain before once again becoming an independent nation. In 1950, Chinese troops invaded Tibet to enforce China's age-old claim to the country. Some areas became the Tibetan Autonomous Region and others were assimilated into neighboring Chinese provinces. In 1959, after a failed anti-Chinese revolt, the spiritual leader of Tibet, the 14th Dalai Lama, fled the country and set up a government in exile in India. During China's Cultural Revolution, many Buddhist monasteries were destroyed and thousands of Tibetans were likely slaughtered during martial law. Due to international pressure in the 1980s, China somewhat relaxed its grip on Tibet and implemented reforms. Currently, Beijing continues to modernize Tibet, sometimes at the cost of the region's cultural heritage. Development has brought Han Chinese migrants and Western tourism to the area. Since the early 2000s, there have been protests in Tibet, especially on the anniversaries of politically significant dates. Human rights groups say that China continues to politically and religiously repress Tibet. Various activists worldwide campaign for an independent Tibet. There are several strategic and economic motives China has for governing the region. Tibet is highly important to China's sense of self and Chinese nationalism. Many Chinese leaders, past and present, have believed that no matter the lines drawn on the map, Tibet is fundamentally a part of China. They felt a strong nationalistic drive to return China to its ancient, far-flung Qing dynasty borders. Tibet also serves as a buffer zone between China on one side and India, Nepal, and Bangladesh on the other. The Himalayan mountain range provides natural security as well as a military advantage. China is currently struggling to find a balance between environmental issues and yet not hinder the country's economic industry. China is hungry for natural resources and Tibet serves as a crucial water source, as well as possessing significant mineral wealth. Since the early 2000s, Beijing has invested billions in Tibet as part of its wide-ranging economic development plan for Western China. Number 2. Arunachal Pradesh. China also claims that the region of Arunachal Pradesh, the northeasternmost state of the 28 states of India, is a part of South Tibet and therefore a part of China. Aside from India, Taiwan also claims the South Tibet region. Arunachal Pradesh borders the Indian states of Assam and Nagaland to the south, and countries Bhutan to the west, Myanmar to the east. To the north, the demarcation line known as the McMahon Line separates Arunachal Pradesh from the Tibetan area of China. Historically, Arunachal Pradesh belonged to neither China nor India, but was dominated by several autonomous tribes. In 1913 to 1914, representatives from Great Britain, China, and Tibet held the Simla Conference to decide on the borderlines for Tibet. The Tibetan and British officials agreed on the McMahon Line as the border between British India and Outer Tibet. The Chinese representatives refused the demarcation line and have considered it invalid ever since. When China invaded Tibet in 1950 and the Dalai Lama later fled Tibet, India supported the Tibetan government, angering China. During the Sino-Indian border conflict in 1962, China captured most of the area of Arunachal Pradesh, but ended up withdrawing. In recent years, tensions have risen as China has publicly claimed the region of Arunachal Pradesh. China is especially interested in a small district called Tawang, which borders Tibet and Bhutan. China has even gone so far as to destroy thousands of maps and make new ones, having renamed parts of Arunachal Pradesh with Chinese names. India, while not growing as fast as China, is still emerging as a regional economic powerhouse. China wants to dominate Asia and sometimes seems to look for ways to clash with India. Most importantly, it's strongly assumed that there are heavy deposits of minerals such as gold and lithium in Arunachal Pradesh. A large-scale Chinese mining operation found gold and silver deposits worth around $60 billion in the Lunzi County of Tibet, which is directly adjacent to Arunachal Pradesh. Number 3. Aksai Chin. China and India also clash over another border region, Aksai Chin, near Kashmir. Aksai Chin is mainly in Hotan County, in the southwestern part of the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, with a small area on the southeast and south sides lying within the extreme west of the Tibet Autonomous Region. India claims Aksai Chin as part of the Ladakh region of the Jammu and Kashmir state. Aksai Chin is a remote, inhospitable region where mainly nomadic tribes roam. The area was ignored until the 1950s when China built a military road through it to connect Tibet with Xinjiang. India was angry upon discovery of the road, and it ended up being a major factor in the Sino-Indian border conflict of 1962. At the end of the clash, China retained control of around 14,700 square miles of territory in Aksai Chin. In 1993 and 1996, the two countries signed agreements to respect the line of actual control, the demarcation line that separates Indian-controlled territory from Chinese-controlled territory in Jammu and Kashmir. Not only does China want Aksai Chin for maintaining a direct route between Tibet and Xinjiang, it appreciates the territory for its strategic position. Aksai Chin is mostly high ground with an average elevation of around 17,000 feet. If China ever goes to war with its neighbors Pakistan, Kashmir, and India, the Aksai Chin region will enable it to take a commanding high position. Number 4. The South China Sea. As well as claiming disputed land, China has also claimed islands in the South China Sea. In fact, China has taken to dredging the sea and building out uninhabited islands such as Woody Island or the Spratly Islands to tighten its control over the region. 6 countries, the Philippines, Vietnam, China, Brunei, Taiwan, and Malaysia, hold different territorial, sometimes overlapping claims of the South China Sea, based on various historical accounts and geography. Adding to the tension, the U.S. Navy frequently patrols the sea due to its alliance with several countries. China considers this to be a provocation. The South China Sea is very important to Beijing because it's a crucial commercial passage connecting Asia with Europe and Africa. 1/3 of global shipping, or $3.37 trillion of international trade, passes through the South China Sea. Furthermore, the seabed is rich with major oil and gas reserves. The U.S. Energy Information Administration estimates the region contains at least 11 billion barrels of crude oil and 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. Also, the South China Sea is a vital food source, accounting for 10% of the world's fisheries. In July 2016, an international tribunal in The Hague ruled that China had no historic rights over the sea and that some of the rocky outcrops claimed by several countries could not legally be used as the basis for territorial claims. Beijing rejected the ruling. More recently, some Southeast Asian nations have considered having bilateral talks with China to settle the dispute. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, has been working with China to create an official code of conduct to avoid clashes in the disputed waters. Number 5. Taiwan. China has had an ongoing dispute with Taiwan for decades. It views Taiwan as a breakaway province that will eventually be part of the country again. But many Taiwanese citizens want a completely separate nation. Historically, Taiwan was a part of China. Taiwan was governed by China's Qing dynasty from 1683 to 1895. When Japan won the First Sino-Japanese War, China had to cede the region to them. After World War II, Japan was forced to relinquish to China control of the territory it had previously taken. Civil war broke out in China in 1946 and ended in a victory for Mao Zedong's Communist Army. Chiang Kai-shek and his Chinese Nationalist Party, known as Kuomintang or KMT, fled to Taiwan. The KMT dominated Taiwan's politics for many years until after Chiang Kai-shek's death. Having inherited an effective dictatorship and under pressure from a burgeoning democracy movement, Chiang's son, Chiang Ching-kuo, began assessing a process of democratization, which in 2000 led to the election of the island's first non-KMT president, Chen Shui-bian. Meanwhile, China treated Taiwan with great hostility. In the 1980s, relations between China and Taiwan started improving. China put forth the One Country, Two Systems plan, under which Taiwan would be given significant autonomy if it accepted Chinese reunification. Taiwan refused, but did relax rules for its citizens to visit and investment in China. Since the 1970s, the U.S. has been a close ally of Taiwan and has sold billions in defensive weapons to the country. Currently, U.S. policy in the region has been described as strategic ambiguity, seeking to balance recognition of China's emergence as a regional power with the U.S. support for Taiwan's economic success and democratization. In recent years, China has been alarmed by Taiwanese citizens electing politicians who favor independence from China. Furthermore, the Taiwanese public has staged various protests about Beijing's policies regarding the country. Currently, Taiwan's legal status is unclear, in limbo. The country has its own constitution, democratically elected leaders, and its own armed forces with about 300,000 active troops. China wants Taiwan to return to the fold because of nationalism. Also, Taiwan being a part of China is a strategic defensive move. If Taiwan was to become an independent nation with its close ties to America, the US would likely have a naval port and military base in Taiwan, right on China's doorstep. Number 6. Hong Kong. One final place where China is attempting to expand its power is Hong Kong. At the end of the First Opium War in 1842, part of Hong Kong Island became a British colony. Later, China leased the rest of Hong Kong, the new territories, to the British for 99 years. By the 1950s, Hong Kong had become a busy commercial port and a manufacturing hub. As the end of the 99-year lease approached, Britain and China held talks on the future of Hong Kong. In 1984, a deal was reached that Hong Kong would return to China in 1997 under the principle of one country, two systems. As a result, Hong Kong has a high degree of autonomy with its own legal system and borders, and rights including freedom of assembly and free speech for the next 50 years. However, in recent years, Beijing has been treading on Hong Kong's rights. Artists and writers say they're under increased pressure to self-censor, and democracy has been limited. The current leader was elected by a 1,200-member pro-Beijing election committee chosen by just 6% of eligible voters. Throughout the spring and summer of 2019, large protests erupted in Hong Kong in response to a proposed bill permitting the extradition of fugitives to mainland China. Citizens worry the bill will be used to target, detain, and extradite political dissidents. Beijing's response to the protests has become increasingly violent as the citizens show no signs of backing down. China considers Hong Kong a bridge between Asia and the West for business and financial matters. Also, once again, China's domination of Hong Kong seems to be fueled by nationalistic fervor. In the year 2020, the US is still the world's sole superpower, but China is not far behind. Both nations have huge amounts of influence across the globe and economies that generate enormous wealth. But what about their militaries? If China and the United States were to go to war, who would have the advantage? In this military comparison, we're pitting China's People's Liberation Army against the United States military to see how they match up. After we lay out the capabilities of each, we'll decide who will win in an all-out war. Bear in mind that both of these militaries are always changing, so it's important to keep an eye on the future. In the end, it'll all come down to which country has the stronger and smarter military. Let's see if you come to the same conclusion we do of who would win in a war between China and the United States of America. In terms of resources, China and the US are both well equipped to support their militaries during the war. It's well known that the United States spends more money than any other country on its military. The most recent military budget for the United States was around $721 billion. That's more than many countries' entire GDP. On the other hand, China's military budget is around $178 billion. Notice the huge contrast between the two nations' military spending. Just in pure spending, the United States beats China. But just because a country spends a lot of money does not mean they have the better military equipment or personnel. Although the United States invests more money in their military, China leads with a different resource: manpower. If all-out war happened, the ability to manufacture weapons and replenish casualties would be vital. The current population of the United States is just over 330 million people. The population of China, around 1.5 billion people. Of course, not everyone in each population would be able to fight or work in factories, but just in terms of people, China vastly outnumbers the US. This brings us to the active number of military personnel in each country. Who has the bigger military? Well, it should come as no surprise that the number of soldiers in China's military is much larger than the United States. With more people in the country, there are more people in the military. In fact, the number of military personnel in China is almost double the amount of military personnel in the United States. The US military consists of around 1.3 million personnel on active duty. The People's Liberation Army has just over 2 million military personnel. If war broke out between the two countries, the United States would need to immediately reinstate the draft, just to come close to matching the number of military personnel the People's Liberation Army currently has. Due to the immense size of the Pacific Ocean, a war between China and the US would most likely not start on land. So let's first look at the Air Force capabilities of each nation and how they stack up against one another. The total number of military aircraft the United States has is around 5,370. China's Air Force contains about 3,010 planes, but these numbers are always fluctuating as new planes are built and old aircraft are retired. Right now, the Chinese military is building and purchasing aircraft much faster than the US. It's estimated that in a few years, the number of aircraft between the two nations will be comparable. But what about the types of aircraft? Which country has better fighter planes, bombers, and transports? The United States has a vast array of aircraft at their disposal, the most impressive of which are the F-35 Lightning, F-22 Raptor, and F-15 Eagle. These fighter jets help the U.S. maintain air superiority. However, China has its own stealth fighter in the J-20, although it's only available in extremely low numbers and is generally considered a poor man's version of the American F-35. In the air, the American military still retains a lethal advantage over the Chinese military with more sophisticated avionics, a much larger fleet of fifth-generation aircraft, and a far greater number of support aircraft such as tankers and AWACS platforms. American pilots also train on average 20 to 30 hours more per year than their Chinese counterparts, and in more realistic scenarios than the Chinese. As we look at other aspects of the Air Force in each country, we find that larger aircraft such as bombers and transports are not equal. The United States has a clear advantage. There are two reasons for this. The first is because the US just has more aircraft. The second reason is because a lot of money being pumped into the United States military goes to research and development each year. The United States aircrafts are up to date, while the Chinese Air Force is still working with functional but older models. You don't need to look much further than the United States' Boeing B-52 Stratofortress, Northrop B-2 Spirit, and Rockwell B-1 Lancer to show that in terms of dominating ground targets from the air, the US has the advantage. Other than the skies, the next most important military technology in a war between China and the US would be the Navy. Controlling the oceans in this conflict would be vital for success. One of the most important ships in a naval arsenal would be the aircraft carrier. The floating fortresses would be crucial to launching airstrikes on the opposing country. Currently, the United States is the world leader in aircraft carriers. The US has 11 active aircraft carriers, while China only has 2, and only one of those is currently rated as combat ready. This clearly puts dominance of the ocean in favor of the United States military. But what about other warships? If China could destroy the US aircraft carriers, would they have the advantage? The United States currently has around 430 naval ships on active and reserve duty. However, only about 300 of those ships are currently able to deploy at a moment's notice. If war broke out between China and the United States right now, China would have a fleet of 335 ships to call upon. But just like the case for the US, not every ship would be available for combat, with about 20% on each side being currently undergoing maintenance, retrofit, or rest and relaxation for its crews. Without eliminating the US's aircraft carrier fleet, China would stand no chance of victory in the Pacific if all-out conflict took place. Yet, even with American carriers out of action, China would be extremely hard-pressed to deal with the American submarine fleet. While it has its own fleet of 74 subs versus the US's 66, China severely lacks in anti-submarine warfare assets and would be ill-equipped to take on America's silent service. On the American side, a disastrous performance by its own anti-submarine warfare assets during exercises in the early 2000s revealed a terrible crumbling of the American Navy's capability to wage anti-submarine warfare after the end of the Cold War. Since then, and with the help of ultra-silent diesel submarines from partner nations, the US has undertaken great steps to once again bolster its ASW capabilities and is believed to be well prepared to face any enemy fleet as the world prepares for great power competitions once again. For now, the US fleet remains supreme, but it's divided between responsibilities around the world, while China can focus the entirety of its efforts in fighting America's Pacific Fleet alone. With a rapidly modernizing fleet and more sophisticated shipbuilding efforts, China looks set to close the gap between itself and the US in the approaching decades. What would happen if the war made its way to land, though? Obviously, it would depend on where the war was being fought. The nation battling on their home turf would ultimately have the advantage because of their ability to replenish land forces more easily. Let's take location out of the equation and just compare the land-based military capabilities of each nation. We know that in terms of soldiers, China outnumbers the US. We also know that if soldier numbers need to be replenished, there are many more people to choose from in China than in the US. Basically, if the two countries went to war using only soldiers, the United States would eventually succumb to the large number of available manpower China has. That being said, this is not how wars are fought anymore. Instead, land battles can be won using machinery, such as tanks. The United States has a tank arsenal of around 8,010 vehicles. The US's main battle tank is the legendary M1 Abrams, of which not a single one has been lost to enemy action yet. If deployed, the United States tank army would be a devastating force. It would plow through anything in its path. China has fewer tanks at around 6,560, and just under half of those are first-generation tanks dating back to the early Cold War era. Around 2,360 of the Chinese tanks are Type 59s. These tanks were produced in the 50s and 60s. They're antiquated and currently retired but still kept in reserve. This means that the tank force of China is actually much smaller than the United States'. The US pours billions of dollars into upgrading their tanks with state-of-the-art equipment and keeping their forces modernized. Clearly, the United States would decimate China in a tank battle. In today's day and age, battles are rarely fought only on the ground. At some point, they may not even be fought on the planet. Recently, the United States has implemented a new branch of the military, Space Force. Space Force's missions is to organize, train, and equip space forces in order to protect U.S. and allied interests in space and to provide space capabilities to the Joint Force. It is clear that the United States is moving toward militarizing this new horizon. But is China? Recent reports have shown that China has been rapidly expanding its space program. They were the third country to launch a human into space behind the former Soviet Union, now Russia, and the United States. China completed this feat back in 2003 and has since ramped up their space program. They are the first and only country to put a rover on the far side of the moon, where they've made several discoveries. China has also been launching more and more satellites and military spacecraft into space in recent years. It's estimated that China has more than 320 satellites. 105 of them are military in nature. The United States has around 123 military satellites, even though the US has been in space much longer than China. It would seem that the breakthroughs at the China National Space Administration have greatly sped up the military satellite capabilities of the country. The budget for NASA in the United States has been cut year after year, almost immediately after they put the first man on the moon. China's space program, on the other hand, seems to be getting an influx of money each year from the government. How long until the research and development of China's engineers and space scientists surpass the US? In space, the country with the best technology and most knowledge of the environment will be victorious in battle. If the United States continues to fall behind in space exploration, they will not stand a chance in the space war with China. This brings us to our last comparison between the two countries, a comparison that has no winner. Instead, everyone loses. We're talking about nuclear weapons. As of right now, China has an estimated total of 320 nuclear warheads. That might seem like a lot, but it is nothing compared to the amount of nuclear weapons the United States has stockpiled. The United States has about 6,370 nuclear warheads under its control. 2,000 of those nukes are awaiting to be dismantled and disposed of. However, if nuclear war broke out between China and the US, neither country would get a chance to use all their nuclear weapons. The human race would be annihilated long before then. So, it's probably in China's and the United States' and the entire world's best interest that nuclear war never comes. Although the United States has a slight military advantage over China, we can't underestimate how far China's military has come in a relatively short amount of time. Also, the vast amount of manpower could be enough to allow China to hold out for a long time, slowly depleting the United States' resources. However, the reason we believe that the United States would win a war with China is because of experience. The United States has a lot more military experience than China. This means that the leaders of the military have seen combat and know what works and what doesn't. The US has been at war almost perpetually in one form or another since World War II, most recently in the Middle East. Since the beginning of Desert Storm in 1991, the United States has maintained a military presence in the Middle East. In fact, the United States has been fighting in Afghanistan for almost 18 years. This means military personnel and leaders have constantly been gaining skills and experience in the art of war. China, on the other hand, has not fought in a war in over 40 years. The last war they fought in was in 1979 when China invaded Vietnam. Vietnam had just come out of its own civil war and had gained much experience during that time. The small country was able to humiliate the Chinese military, forcing them out of their country after only 3 weeks. It seems that experience can outweigh sheer numbers during wartime. It is for this reason that we believe the United States would win a war with China if it were fought today. However, and some of you might have already seen this coming, if China continues to expand and upgrade their military as they've been doing in recent years, it will not be long before their military strength surpasses the United States. If this happens, it's a very real possibility that China would win a war against the United States in the future. Their drive to update their machinery and technology can be seen in their space program and the expansion of their military. Within the next decade, we at the Infographics Show may need to make a new video to reevaluate this military comparison between China and the United States, with the winner being the People's Liberation Army of China. In mid-June 2020, World War III started trending on Twitter again. This time it was because a border dispute in the Himalayas between Chinese and Indian forces turned deadly, killing upward of 20 people. This is the first time since 1975 that the two countries have had a fatal conflict, and the most serious skirmish since 1967. Naturally, as the two nations are populous, militarily powerful, and have nuclear capabilities, the world is biting its nails to see what happens next. But assuming the whole thing doesn't end in diplomacy or a world-consuming mushroom cloud, which country has what it takes to bring home a final victory? Using a mix of historical precedents of the prior conflicts between the two countries and our knowledge of their current military capabilities, we intend to find out exactly whether China or India would win if the two nations went to war today. After all, we're not just talking about dusty hypotheticals here. Relations between India and China have been extremely strained since the Sino-Indian War of 1962, which occurred over the same stretch of the Himalayan border that's causing conflicts today. India had granted the Dalai Lama asylum within their borders after the fallout of the 1959 Tibetan Uprising, already putting them in China's bad books. And with China's military encroaching on the line of actual control, the demarcation line that separates Indian and Chinese territory in the Himalayas, a military skirmish was practically inevitable. The resulting conflict was short-lived, lasting only 1 month and 1 day between October and November of 1962. The People's Liberation Army of China had a vast numerical superiority over India's military forces, and India suffered significantly greater losses, with nearly double China's deaths, many wounded, and over 3,000 captured. This loss is partly chalked up to the fact that it's believed, according to some leaked CIA documents, that India underestimated both China's military capabilities and their willingness to escalate the conflict. While India requested military assistance from the US in the form of 12 squadrons of fighter jets, their pleas were rejected, and India instead turned to Moscow for assistance. Ultimately, none of it did all that much good, as China claimed the eastern theater up to the line of actual control before declaring a unilateral ceasefire. India was left to lick its wounds, and tensions between the two countries have been high ever since, with conflicts still breaking out well into the 70s. Both nations have ramped up militarization around the line of actual control as a show of strength, and this has left both with very little room to maneuver. In a sense, the Himalayan border is a military powder keg, and lately we've been seeing the sparks. While a past record of military supremacy definitely works in China's favor, the Sino-Indian War was also 58 years ago, and failure is an excellent teacher. India has been engaged in frequent conflicts since the Sino-Indian War, giving their combatants invaluable battlefield experience. India is widely believed to have won every conflict they engaged in post-Sino-Indian War, with the exception of the Indo-Pakistani War of 1965, which ended in a ceasefire. China comparatively fought its last considerable conflict against Vietnamese forces in 1979. Once again, experience won out here, as the Vietnamese, who'd recently honed their skills in battle against the forces of the United States, are largely considered to have handed China's asses to them. This is why the value of actual experience in war can never be overstated. But let's take a step back and look at what these two militaries have to offer in terms of manpower, technology, training, and resources. First, soldiers, the bread and butter of any military. Much like the Sino-Indian War, China has numerical superiority, though in India's defense, seeing as China is ranked as having the highest number of active military personnel in the world at 2,035,000, China's military has numerical superiority over literally everyone. With over 500,000 reserve personnel who could be easily called into action in a wartime scenario, China is a force to be reckoned with. India, however, isn't all that far behind, with 1,237,117 active personnel and an impressive 960,000 reserve personnel, putting the difference between their totals in the mere hundred thousands. But here's the big twist. The numbers here only pertain to the Indian Army, which is the ground force branch of the Indian Armed Forces, whose total number of active personnel are 1,444,500, second only to the PLA's total active personnel. However, the overall numbers of reserve personnel for the Indian Armed Forces now dwarfs China's at an astonishing 2.1 million. The Indian Navy boasts 67,252 active personnel and 55,000 reserves. The Indian Air Force has 139,576 active personnel and 140,000 reserves. In contrast to India's three-pronged system, the PLA consists of 5 branches: the Ground Force, Navy, Air Force, Rocket Force, and the Strategic Assault Force. The Ground Force is the Chinese infantry and land-based operations, with 975,000 active personnel. The PLA Navy has 240,000 active personnel. The Air Force even higher at 398,000 active personnel. The People's Liberation Army Rocket Force, also known by the pretty funny acronym PLARF, is the branch of the military in charge of the land-based ballistic and nuclear armaments. They have only 100,000 active personnel. And finally, the Strategic Assault Force. This is the newest branch of the PLA, established officially in 2015, dealing with extremely modern forms of warfare like space and cyber operations. This division is so new that we don't even have an exact number of active personnel, but due to the specialization of the job and the fact that the group is only 5 years old, it's safe to assume that it's likely the smallest branch of the PLA. However, we also have a far wider trend to consider here. The fact that China and India are two of the most populous nations on Earth, with populations of 1.393 billion and 1.353 billion respectively, as of 2018. In a situation of all-out war over their shared border, if both nations introduced conscription, the numerical differences between their armies would ultimately be nebulous. So, if neither army would have an extreme numerical edge in the case of another conflict, let's zoom in and take a look at the average military service member in each infantry, specifically their training, equipment, and weaponry. Thankfully for India, they've grown to invest in more intensive military training over the years, including joint operations training with the British, US, Japanese, French, and Australian militaries as their involvement in the UN deepened. The Indian military has also consistently invested in modernized primary assault rifle systems for their troops, currently working with a mix of American Sig Sauer 716 assault rifles and an Indo-Russian AK-47-203, a modernization of the famously reliable and hardy AK-47. As of 2018, Indian infantry troops are fitted with SMPP ballistic armor, even capable of withstanding blasts from the steel core rounds fired out of an AK-47. All these factors add up to one formidable individual soldier. China's infantry troops don't have quite the same thing going for them. Modern Chinese military training has been criticized for years for its lack of useful applications in real-life combat scenarios, meaning the average military skills of a Chinese infantryman may leave something to be desired compared to their Indian counterparts. They're formidable in the rifle department with the QBZ-95-1, a reliable bullpup rifle which performs best at long range. However, despite China being one of the world's most prolific exporters of body armor, it hasn't historically fitted its troops with that same standard of protection. The PLA is notorious for its light loadout, often leaving soldiers ill-prepared for taking fire, and giving the Indian infantry troops a huge comparative advantage. However, this may change in the not-too-distant future. According to a report from Global Times, China is investing heavily in updating and modernizing its training system, as well as planning on procuring 1.4 million units of high-quality body armor for the PLA. While this isn't currently a certainty, if these plans do go through, any advantages that the Indian Army may have had on an individual soldier level would essentially evaporate, leaving them dead even once again. But these days, war is far more complex than a large group of armed men running at each other and fighting down to the last one standing. In modern warfare, technology can give militaries the crucial edge they need to secure a victory over the enemy. Since 2008, China and India have ranked second and third respectively in global military spending, but the gap between them is still pretty immense. Last year, China spent an astonishing $261 billion on military development, compared to India's far smaller $71.1 billion. This disparity becomes a little more natural when you realize that China's economy is 5 times the size of India's. Let's take a look at how these numbers actually translate into vehicles for their armies, navies, and air forces. While China is generally packing more hardware than India, one exception is in the world of tanks, where India's over 4,200 stands over 1,000 units greater than China's 3,200 plus tanks. However, this doesn't paint the whole picture of China's ground capabilities. If we're looking at the number of armored ground vehicles overall, China's 33,000 dwarfs India's 8,600, giving them considerable ground superiority, bolstered by the fact that they have 10 times more rocket projectors than their Indian counterparts. China also holds dominance over the skies with 3,210 aircraft compared to India's 2,123. It also has approximately double the fighter and interceptor jets and 507 workable airports compared to India's 346. Once again, sadly for India, this trend continues into the country's navies. In terms of total naval assets, China outnumbers India by 777 to 285. More specifically, it has 74 submarines to India's 16, 36 destroyers to India's 11, and if wars were decided on equipment alone, it's unquestionable that China would take the win here. Of course, while nobody on Earth wants the conflict to escalate to this point for the sake of all human life, we'd be remiss to not return to the fact that China and India are both nuclear nations. If the war ever did become an exchange of nuclear force, who would come out on top? Well, for a number of reasons, China has a clear edge here. Not only did they develop their nuclear capabilities just over a decade earlier than India in 1964, New Delhi wouldn't have its first nuke until 1975, but their nuclear arsenal is also double the size of India's with a far quicker growth rate. China has a stockpile of 320 nuclear warheads, having grown by 40 in the past year. Compare this to India with only 150 nuclear warheads, which grew by a mere 10 in the past year. Both nations can deploy these warheads via the nuclear triad of missiles, submarines, and bombers, and thankfully for the human race, both have a no first strike policy. This means the warheads can only be used in retaliation to another nuclear attack, making it less likely that either country would want to strike first. Of course, if either did, all of us would ultimately lose from the resulting radioactive firefight. But on sheer numbers, China takes the clear win with regard to nuclear capabilities. One final factor worth considering is one that's rarely mentioned in a lot of abstract military planning: allies. While it's easy to think of war purely in terms of enemies, your diplomatic and military friends can also be a make or break factor in determining the outcome of a conflict. While China could largely be working a solo war against India with the exception of perhaps Pakistan, a country with fraught relationships with India to say the least, India itself has been building diplomatic relationships with a number of extremely valuable allies. These include the United States, a country with the highest military spending in the world, who under President Trump have gone cold on relations with China while referring to India as a major defense partner. India has also developed strong diplomatic ties to Japan, France, and Australia through performing a number of joint military drills with all of them. Having these various world powers behind them gives India a serious combat edge over China, providing these allies come to India's side in their time of need. While the US could be India's greatest ally in this speculative war, foreign policy under President Trump has been known to be capricious and unreliable to other allies, such as the Kurdish forces in Syria in 2019. So there's really no way of telling for sure. So back to our big question: who would win in a modern conflict between India and China? Turns out it's a lot more complex than you may have thought. While a layman might assume that China's apparent numerical and monetary advantages hand it an easy win, these advantages can be neutralized by India's stronger troops, who are better equipped, better trained, and more experienced, and its greater network of powerful allies. Then there's the strategic picture. As while the Indian Navy is smaller than the Chinese Navy, India itself is situated on the jugular of Chinese trade, so to speak. Chinese trade ships must pass through the Indian Ocean to reach their destinations, and while China may have a larger fleet, it's not very well equipped to conduct operations far from its own shores. With only 2 aircraft carriers with a capacity of about 24 aircraft between them, and one not even being operational yet, any Chinese incursion into the Indian Ocean to protect its trade fleets would be disastrous, as the Chinese task force would be brutally pounded by Indian air and naval power. With China receiving the bulk of its oil from maritime trade routes, a protracted war between the two nations would inevitably cripple the Chinese military and industry both. India would simply have to fight defensively, as the terrain separating India and China is extremely difficult and well suited to defensive warfare. While the Chinese could crush any Indian incursion into China itself, and there'd be few strategic targets to take close to the Indian border anyway, a war between the two nations would inevitably see India the winner, as it slowly strangles Chinese trade to death. With Russia hogging all the negative press lately, you might have missed Chinese President Xi Jinping's adamant proclamation that Taiwan will be reunited with the mainland. And he is not ruling out military force to accomplish this goal. But with the vast majority of Taiwanese citizens wanting nothing to do with mainland communist China and American President Joe Biden promising that the US would come to Taiwan's aid, World War III is looking more likely, and it won't be starting in Europe. How is China going to defeat the US and its allies? And more importantly, why does Taiwan matter so much that the US is willing to fight to keep it free and independent? China wants Taiwan, and the US wants Taiwan to remain free. Both sides have their various reasons, but there are some significant overlaps. For China, Taiwan is both a matter of national prestige and a national defense priority. The island is home to the Chinese nationalists who fled after losing the war against the communists after World War II. And given the difficulty of an invasion plus the support of the United States, reunifying this breakaway province by force has not been an option for China. It's only recently, with China's vast modernization of its military and steadily expanding amphibious assault capabilities, that the dream of taking over Taiwan is approaching fruition. But as long as Taiwan remains fiercely independent and refuses to bow to Beijing, China cannot be taken seriously as a global military power. After all, why should anyone fear your military when it can't even pacify an island sitting right off your own shores? For the Chinese Communist Party, Taiwan represents an existential threat, though. The nation began as a dictatorship but gradually became a liberal and open democracy. Today, it's amongst the most successful democracies in the world, and that's a big problem for the CCP. As long as Taiwan remains independent, it remains a symbol for the Chinese people of what life could be like for them if they were no longer under the thumb of the CCP. After the extreme measures enacted by President Xi during and after COVID, disillusionment with China's government and the very society it's built around has skyrocketed amongst the youth. To many of them, the democracy lurking right off their own shore is a more appealing choice, and as long as Taiwan remains independent, it'll continue singing its siren song of democracy to the Chinese people. However, there are two very real and very significant strategic reasons for China to want to take Taiwan back and for the US to want it to remain independent. First is a Western strategy known as the First Island Chain. This is a chain of pro-Western friendly nations that ring the shores of China and Russia both. During the Cold War, it acted as a physical barrier to communist navies in case of war, who would be hemmed in and unable to operate in open waters without being destroyed attempting to break to the open sea. The First Island Chain also allows friendly navies to operate very close to enemy shores by having resupply and repair facilities readily available and not relying on far-flung bases, which would limit loiter time for friendly ships and aircraft. Today, the First Island Chain strategy no longer hems in the Soviet Union and its allies and instead acts as a barrier to Chinese expansionism. China has attempted to break the First Island Chain by illegally building artificial islands in the South China Sea, and while the threat they pose is significant, it still doesn't allow the Chinese Navy to break the defenses of the First Island Chain completely, and it doesn't allow them to push hostile navies far enough away that Chinese shipping can continue to keep the nation supplied with the vital petroleum and natural gas it needs. Another strategic reason to want reunification with Taiwan could potentially impact the entire world, though. Today, Taiwan is the world's largest manufacturer of computer chips and semiconductors, wielding such significant clout that its embargo of Russia has all but crippled the nation's ability to build modern weapons. Taiwan's contribution to the global technology market is so significant that as the Chinese threat over the island grows, the United States has passed emergency funding for computer chip manufacturing plants to be built inside of America once more. If China were to seize Taiwan, it would in effect be in control of nearly all the world's supply of advanced electronic components and be able to threaten embargoes to nations that don't toe the CCP's line. A nation would have a simple choice: have its economy crippled or do as President Xi says. So how can China achieve its goals, even if it means launching World War III, and come out on top? China has already prepared extensively for conflict against the superior US Navy, and has done a really good job of it too. The surface combat ships are still no match for American vessels, with China having approximately 2/3 of the total battle force missiles that the US Navy has. Its Air Force is similarly outclassed by the US Air Force, which not only outnumbers China's, but has far better capabilities in all but one department: long-range air-to-air missiles, where the Chinese PL-15 enjoys a significant advantage over the American AIM-120 in terms of range. However, the US is fast-tracking an upgrade called the AIM-260 Joint Advanced Tactical Missile to not just close the gap, but exceed it once more. US air and naval power won't matter though if it can't bring all that might close to Chinese shores, which is why China has invested heavily into developing a strategy known as Anti-Access Area Denial, or A2AD. The goal is simple: keep American ships and special mission aircraft such as AWACS and tankers away from Chinese shores so the People's Liberation Navy can operate with impunity. At the core of the strategy is the People's Liberation Army Rocket Force, or PLARF. PLARF might sound like something you do after a bad burrito, but it's the gravest threat the US Navy has faced since the end of the Cold War, and it might be good enough to keep the US ships out of the Western Pacific for good. A ballistic missile force, this branch of the Chinese military is dedicated to China's vast stockpile of both nuclear and non-nuclear ballistic missiles. China was never subject to the Intermediate Range Force Treaty, or INF, and thus, unlike the Soviet Union and the US, China developed an extensive stockpile of conventional ballistic missiles. Today, China fields about 1,400 ballistic missiles alongside hundreds of cruise missiles. Most of these are older, shorter-range missiles which we could expect to see deployed against Taiwanese infrastructure, but hundreds have ranges capable of hitting US bases in Japan and South Korea. A small but unknown number can even hit the all-important US base in Guam. The PLARF would be critical in the opening days of World War III. Both the US and China hold serious counterforce power, and the advantage would go to whoever fires first. A war between the two powers would almost certainly be a bolt-out-of-the-blue attack, an unexpected first strike using hundreds of ballistic missiles. The targets would be US bases in the region, with a priority target being Guam. However, this comes with certain risk, as striking U.S. bases in Japan and South Korea would threaten dragging those two nations into the conflict. South Korea may be disinclined to join the conflict out of fear of North Korea taking advantage of the situation. In fact, for China to win, it would be in its best interest to proceed a war in the Pacific with ramped-up antics from North Korea, enough to rattle South Korea without actually crossing the line over into war. Fears of North Korean aggression would be likely enough to prevent South Korea from doing anything other than voicing public support for its American allies. Japan would be a different story. The two nations are famous rivals, and there's still a lot of bad blood between China and Japan. What's more, Japan agrees with the U.S. that China presents a threat to democracies around the world. Losing a fellow democracy like Taiwan to China could represent a larger global shift toward authoritarianism. China, being the dominant regional power, is also greatly disadvantageous to Japan, whose all-important trade routes pass by close enough to China to be intercepted by its navy should Taiwan fall and the first island chain be broken. Thus, it's almost a foregone conclusion that Japan would join the war anyway, no matter what China ends up doing. The rewriting of its constitution allows the expeditionary deployment of its military, bucking the self-defense pacifist ideology of the past, and it's proof that Japan is actively preparing to send ships, troops, and planes to aid the US and Taiwan. This is a serious problem for China because Japan provides a convenient staging ground for both the US naval and air forces. A significant number of ballistic missiles would have to be dedicated to striking Japanese air bases and harbors in order to deny both to the US military. Chinese military doctrine states that the PLARF is to be used in a swift, precise, and overwhelming strike against an enemy force. This means eliminating the greatest threat to Chinese ambitions in the region, the United States Navy. It's not enough to shut down U.S. bases and airfields. America has a huge expeditionary capability and lots of friends from where they could stage ships and planes. Winning the war in the Pacific means beating the U.S. Navy black and blue. China is counting on the U.S.'s public aversion to military casualties to win the war the moment it starts. To achieve it, it needs to score huge losses to the U.S. at the onset of the war in terms of both men and material. That's why U.S. aircraft carrier strike groups are China's #1 priority. Not only do American supercarriers threaten all Chinese naval shipping, but the loss of even a single carrier would result in the death of thousands of American sailors. This is something China hopes it can use to shock and awe the American public into not supporting a protracted war. Because China cannot win a long-term conflict against the U.S., it simply lacks the material and ability to protect its trade overseas, while it can do nothing to threaten American global trade. With U.S. carriers kept at bay with ballistic missiles and friendly airfields destroyed, China would have a week or two to achieve its objective of capturing Taiwan. However, China faces 3 critical problems with its war plans. The first is that any invasion of Taiwan would take weeks to coordinate. Ships would have to be restationed to nearby harbors. Hundreds of thousands of troops would have to be moved from various military districts to the eastern one in preparation of boarding. Supplies like food, water, and medicine would have to be gathered in the millions of tons and prepared for shipping across the strait. Hundreds of aircraft would have to be moved to nearby airfields. Basically, an invasion of Taiwan would be anything but a bolt out of the blue. It would be a very publicly broadcast event that would have months of warning. The United States would use this time to gather global support for either painful political and economic measures against China or to build a national military coalition like it did in Desert Storm. In an unprecedented move, European NATO partners have been sending ships to the South Pacific in the last 6 months. These routine patrols are meant to signal one thing to China: Europe stands with the US and against an invasion of Taiwan. Invading Taiwan would mean taking on an international coalition. And there's no ready answer to this daunting problem for China, who enjoys few meaningful alliances and 0 who would support it in war against what would in effect be a global force. The second problem China faces is that though its ballistic missile force is a deadly threat to U.S. forces, it might not be able to effectively deter U.S. naval operations the way China hopes it will. Hitting a stationary airbase with a ballistic missile from thousands of miles away is relatively easy. China has reduced the circular probability of error from 100 to just 5 or 10 meters for its modern missiles. However, hitting a fast-moving warship in the middle of the ocean is a different challenge altogether. Ballistic missiles and other standoff weapons need good tracking data to hit a moving target. This means that a ship must be first discovered, properly identified, and then finally fixed. China has greatly improved both its ground-based and satellite-based long-range radar capabilities, but this type of radar can only tell you a ship is out there with an approximate distance. Accuracy of satellites, however, is greater, though they provide only a temporary track as they orbit the Earth. In order to properly identify and then provide a good track, you need a much better sensor technology, and it's unknown if China can foot the bill there. A vast investment in drones and AWACS aircraft means that China potentially has the tools to get the job done, but these airborne assets have to face the threat of the most capable air force in the world. China does enjoy an advantage here because the US would have to operate aircraft at extremely long ranges, but a decided uptick in both the purchase of air and sea drones by the US military, as well as a new tanker drone, means that the reach of America's weapons is being steadily and greatly increased. Even if China can overcome the difficulties in hitting moving targets, there's still one Achilles heel it has no solution for, neither today nor in the projected future. China depends on overseas trade for the majority of its oil and natural gas imports. It does have two land-based connections to Russia, but one of these, the pipeline from Sakhalin, would make an easy target for a cruise missile strike via submarine. That would leave only one inflow of oil and natural gas in the far west out of US reach. This would basically be a trickle compared to China's current fossil fuel supply, and within weeks the nation would run out of oil altogether. Its military could fight on for a few months at most due to the strategic reserves, but its economy would come crashing to a halt as the civilian sector becomes energy-starved. To add insult to injury, over 60% of Chinese trade comes via the ocean. Except it wouldn't in case of war, thanks to the US Navy. Even if its ballistic missile forces are effective at keeping the US Navy at bay, ballistic missiles can't stop the huge US attack submarine fleet. Surface task forces could also easily choke off China at multiple traffic choke points for maritime trade, including the Malacca Straits, the Gulf of Oman, and the Panama Canal. China is attempting to secure ports and airfields outside of the country so it can base forces near these strategically important waterways, but so far has only succeeded in gaining the use of a small base at Djibouti, only miles from a much bigger American base. With the bulk of the world on the US's ideological side and the vast network of friends and partners the US can use to leverage pressure on anyone contemplating allowing China to build military bases on their territory, it's not predicted that China's forward-deployed military forces will grow in any significant amount. The Chinese Navy may be the largest in the world today, but most of these ships are smaller vessels meant to act as missile boats or harass the fishing vessels and oil-exploring ships of neighboring nations, not attempting to dislodge a U.S. carrier strike group from a vital trade artery. For all its planning, there's nothing China can do about this situation in the current or even long term, though it is steadily working at building a blue water navy capable of operations far from home shores. It still has a significant way to go to get there, however, and even the U.S. remains firmly in the lead. You're sipping on a cup of steaming coffee in mission control of the China National Space Administration. The room is covered from wall to wall with glowing screens and monitors. You lean back in your chair and gaze through the wisps of haze rising from your mug. All is quiet as you're about to shut down the U-22 rover for its daily recharge. Suddenly, a scientist bursts through the doors, his hair disheveled. His eyes are as large as full moons. "You won't believe this," he pants. "We found something." You stand up and rush over to the scientist. You eagerly urge him to go on, but he has to catch his breath. The scientist finally stands up and sputters, We found something strange on the dark side of the moon." You take a step back and ask him to repeat himself. The scientist said, "I was going through the videos from U-22 and it picked up something strange, something that we can't explain." A million thoughts race through your head. What could the mysterious object be? You need more information, but you can't help the feeling of butterflies in your stomach as you think, could we have found life? Aliens? A crashed UFO? What is it, you ask as you shake the scientist. "We just don't know. It looks to be a gel-like substance. It's in one of the craters the rover was exploring. There shouldn't be any gel on the moon. There's no atmosphere and it's freezing cold," he responds. A gel-like substance, you think? How could there possibly be a gel-like substance on the moon? You run over to the red telephone on your desk and pick it up. There are no buttons to push. Once the phone is removed from the cradle, it automatically dials the head of the China National Space Administration. The line picks up and you speak into the receiver. "Sir, we found something. I think you should bring everyone in. This could be big." As you wait for your boss and the rest of the team to come in, you think back to December 7th, 2018, when the China National Space Administration launched Chang'e 4. The main goal of the mission was to land on the dark side of the moon and collect data. On January 3rd, 2019, China became the first country to successfully land a spacecraft on the far side of the moon. You smile as you recall that this was no small feat. Several other countries had tried and failed to do what your team accomplished. Landing on the dark side of the moon is difficult because of the inability to maintain constant communication with the spacecraft. The monstrous sphere that is the moon blocks the signals between Earth and any vessel on the other side. To get around the problem, you and your team placed a satellite between the moon and the Earth. The satellite is at an angle which allows you to maintain communication with Chang'e 4 at all times. Once the spacecraft successfully touched down, the U-22 rover drove off the lowered landing platform and cruised across the ancient moon dust. U-22 is the only rover that has ever explored the dark side of the moon. It's an exciting time for all astronomers and astrogeologists. U-22 will collect data that may uncover the mysteries of the moon's early history. You're brought out of your reminiscing when the entire team that's working on Chang'e 4's lunar project floods into mission control. The head of the China National Space Administration walks over to your terminal and says, "Show me what you found." You replay the video from U-22 showing the rover pulling up to the odd gel-like substance. It seems to shimmer like diamonds. It's day 9 of the mission, and you've been up for 24 hours straight, trying to unravel the mystery of what the U-22 rover has uncovered. After the scientists brought this strange object to your attention, you postpone all other driving plans for the foreseeable future, or at least until you can figure out what the heck it is you're looking at. The video footage is delayed by a couple seconds from the vast distance the signal has to travel. You have to program the rover to return to the position where it came across the gel-like substance. With the help of obstacle avoidance cameras, you maneuver the U-22 rover back toward the edge of the crater where the mysterious substance is located. You target the spot where the substance rests. The rover slowly pulls up and comes to a stop. You focus the camera on the gel-like substance. Everyone is holding their breath in anticipation. You cycle through different settings in the tools of the U-2 camera. You examine the substance in the visible light spectrum and then in the near-infrared spectrum. This detects light that scatters and reflects off the strange material. The collected information will help you identify the chemical makeup of the discovery. The data is surprising. You scratch your head as your team tries to identify the substance and understand how it ended up on the moon. One thing that stands out is that the mysterious substance has a unique color. It shimmers like melted glass and has a metallic sheen to it. The object resembles volcanic rock, like obsidian on planet Earth. The moon does not have any active volcanoes and its core has been dead for millennia. Therefore, it would seem that the substance was not created by cooling magma or other volcanic activity. So, what is it then? What could create such a unique substance on the far side of the moon? You and your team of scientists come to the conclusion that at some point a meteor flying hundreds of thousands of miles per hour slammed into the moon's surface. The moon does not have an atmosphere like Earth, so there's nothing to slow the impact of the meteor. There's no protective shield that causes space rocks to burn up on entry and create shooting stars like we see on our planet. The meteor rockets toward the lunar surface without anything to slow it down. The crust of the moon takes the full impact of the space rock. This releases an enormous amount of energy. It's analogous to a nuclear bomb detonating. On Earth, when nuclear weapons are tested, the rocks and sand in the area become superheated and create a glassy mineral called trinitite. The same process happens when meteors impact the moon's surface at high velocities. You and your team conclude that this must be what happened on the far side of the moon to create the unknown substance. The landscape is pocked with meteor impact craters. The lunar surface has been battered for billions of years by the unrelenting rocks hurling through space. It's too early to say with 100% certainty, but the gel-like substance you found is most likely not gel at all. Instead, it's probably similar to the rock formation that astronauts brought back to Earth during the Apollo 17 mission. After that mission, scientists who analyzed the glassy rocks from the near side of the moon concluded that their chemical makeup was consistent with a meteor strike. High-velocity meteor impacts release huge amounts of pressure and heat on minerals they slam into. This compression and superheating causes the chemical structures of regular rocks to shatter. Then, as they cool, the molten minerals reform into a structure that looks like shiny glass and bends light in surprising ways. Something that you and your team note is that this rare mineral may be abundant on the moon. Who knows what new technology and inventions could come from your discovery? You know that the properties of the mystery substance must be studied further. You've made an incredible discovery just 8 days into your mission for the China National Space Administration, but it's time to carry on. The moon holds many unexplained mysteries and opportunities for research. One of the most surprising discoveries you want to investigate further came from Apollo 17, when astronaut and geologist Harrison Schmitt discovered orange-colored soil near the spacecraft's landing site. It would seem that the moon has a knack for creating rocks and soil of interesting colors. The discovery was baffling at the time. Scientists concluded that the orange mystery soil was created during a volcanic eruption 3.64 billion years ago. Although the moon has not been volcanically active for billions of years, in the distant past the surface of the moon was covered with volcanoes. The time during the moon's formation was full of intense seismic activity. Its core was still molten and magma spewed out of numerous volcanoes across the lunar surface. You're hoping to gather more data on the moon's early volcanic activity during your mission. A different mystery your team may help solve was announced recently by NASA. This mystery has to do with the side of the moon where the U-22 rover was located. NASA recently found a massive blob of unknown makeup underneath the surface of the far side of the moon. This mystery blob has a mass relative to 5 piles of metal the size of the Big Island of Hawaii. The blob sits at least 180 miles beneath the South Pole Aitken Basin. The South Pole Aitken Basin is a colossal crater that was created billions of years ago. It was most likely formed when the moon's molten surface was beginning to cool. Before the surface could harden, an asteroid slammed into the crust, creating an enormous indented crater. But what lies below the surface? What is the huge blob? Maybe you and your team at the China National Space Administration can find out, since you are the only ones who have a rover on the far side of the moon. You and your team have already accomplished an astonishing amount in the short time the Chang'e 4 mission has been active. You use reflected radiation to analyze the minerals and composition of the moon's surface where the rover landed. The analysis of the landing site reveals 2 mineral types that are not a match for any of the known minerals in the moon's crust. Maybe these minerals came from the much sought-after lunar mantle. Scientists have been working for years to identify the makeup of the moon's mantle, to understand its formation and the inner layers better. If you and your team can understand the moon's evolution, you can uncover the mysteries of the moon's magnetism. Did the moon have a magnetic field similar to ours in the past? How strong was the magnetic field? Which way was north? All of these questions could be answered by you and your team. The Chang'e 4 mission has relayed information about the lunar dust layer. The moon's dust is called regolith, and your team has discovered that it's thicker than previously thought. The spacecraft your team sent to the far side of the moon has measured the regolith at 39 feet deep. In the past, the dust caused problems to manned missions through clogging vents and reducing visibility. The dust itself came from pulverized rocks that settled on the lunar surface after billions of years of asteroid bombardment. You and your team have confirmed that this dust exists on the far side of the moon, and any future missions need to take into account the danger it poses. Your team, along with other scientists and astronauts, have dreamed of creating a lunar base, a place where astronauts and researchers can go to conduct experiments. It could also be a port or a building facility for spacecraft that will venture further into the solar system. The moon base could serve as the first stop on manned missions to Mars, Venus, or beyond. You now think about how the data collected by Chang'e 4 could be used to make the moon base a reality. You envision sending more rovers to clear the dust, where the habitat could be built. Mining and drilling robots could be sent to harvest moon rocks, and resources to construct the moon base. Perhaps the discovery U-22 made of the mysterious substance will end up being used in future technologies. Your analysis of the minerals on the surface of the dark side of the moon may reveal that it's an ideal location to set up a refueling station. Or maybe later in your mission you find that there's ice or water laying just below the surface of the moon, the most precious resource in all the galaxy. All of these dreams may be possible one day because of the success of the Chang'e 4 mission. The mysterious substance you found still needs further analysis, but it may contain materials that could further space exploration. The data that the China National Space Administration is still collecting from its mission to the far side of the moon may unlock the mysteries of the largest and brightest object in our night sky.
China's meteoric economic rise in the last 3 decades has seen the world's largest nation pick itself up from its agrarian roots to become a robust and modern economy. While not more powerful than the US economically, China's is the only economy in the world to truly rival the US's. Yet all of China's economic expansion has created a crippling national Achilles heel: its overwhelming reliance on naval trade routes to export its trade goods and supply its ravenous appetite for oil. If China is to truly become a peer competitor to the US, it must secure and defend its access to the world's most important shipping lanes. In today's episode of the Infographic Show, we're taking a look at the Asian powerhouse and asking, is China ready to take on the US Navy? For decades, China focused primarily on maintaining national sovereignty by establishing a large ground force capable of fighting off another Japanese invasion or their former Soviet rivals. As China's economy expanded, though, its reliance on maritime trade grew to a staggering disproportion. While every nation relies on maritime trade, China's economy depends on the sea for 60 to 80% of its imports and exports, and almost all of its oil supply. This has placed China in a precarious situation where it is uniquely vulnerable to disruption of those trade routes and forced a shift in focus from a ground army to a growing naval and air force. China's maritime strategic position is unique and completely stacked against it. With the bulk of its oil passing through the Indian Ocean, another of China's longtime rivals, India, is in a position to easily disrupt and even completely shut down Chinese shipping. While China maintains a larger and better equipped naval force than India, Indian ships would enjoy land-based support and quick resupply, while China would have to find a way to forward deploy a sizable battle group to the Indian Ocean that could fend off not just the Indian Navy, but the land-based Indian Air Force as well. Not only is this currently strategically impossible for the limited Chinese Navy, but China also lacks the supply and logistics ships needed to keep a task force out at sea for extended periods of time. War against the US would likely involve India as an American ally, but even if it didn't, China would still have to face America's formidable Pacific Fleet. With 2,000 aircraft and 200 ships, to include 33 nuclear attack submarines, America's Pacific Fleet alone is more than a match for China's entire Navy, which numbers at 193 combat ships and 710 aircraft. In any conflict, the US Pacific Fleet would also quickly be augmented by other American naval forces. So could China hope to fend off the US Pacific Fleet in the event of war? In 1996, in response to the US granting a visa to Taiwan's president Lee Teng-hui, China launched massive military exercises meant to intimidate Taiwan, beginning with live-fire missile and artillery firing just kilometers from Taiwan's shores. This was followed by a widely publicized amphibious assault exercise meant to signal that China was ready and willing to cross the Taiwan Strait and invade the long independent island. In response, the United States deployed 3 aircraft carrier battle groups to the area and an amphibious assault ship, the largest display of American military might in Asia since Vietnam. This brief confrontation forced the Chinese to admit that they could not hope to stop the US from defending Taiwan, and internally, Chinese military leadership doubted the possibility of defeating the US Navy in any combat scenario. Humiliated by the US's response and their inability to prevent it, China reshuffled its military priorities, placing a much greater emphasis on its naval, missile, and air forces. 2 decades later, their efforts have paid off in spades, with China boasting the largest ballistic missile force in the world and a competent, if still limited, navy. Yet China is still saddled with a great deal of internal issues, the most pressing being the systemic corruption that has for decades thrived amongst the Communist Party leadership and the armed forces both. Despite Xi Jinping's anti-corruption purges, the damage to China's military by a long legacy of corrupt and ineffective leadership could take years to reverse. China also faces a serious recruitment, training, and experience problem with its armed forces. Unable to meet military recruitment quotas, China's armed forces have been forced to lower their recruiting standards several times since 2010. This has resulted in a crop of recruits whose current capabilities are questionable to say the least. As noted by Chinese observers, in 2012, a People's Liberation Army unit became so stressed out in the midst of a 15-day wartime simulation that the ongoing exercise had to be put on pause and time taken out for movie nights and karaoke parties. By day 9 of the exercise, a cultural performance troupe, PLA parlance for song and dance girls, had to be brought in to entertain the homesick soldiers whose morale had plummeted. Further reporting notes that this is likely not an isolated incident, and Chinese watchdogs have long observed that China engages in little comprehensive training of its troops in comparison with their Western counterparts. In fact, China's confidence in its own troops is so low that it was only in the early 2010s that Chinese units began to take part in UN peacekeeping deployments, long refusing to take part out of fear of international embarrassment. To further compound China's challenges in waging war against the US or another peer power, the nation has not fought a major conflict since a brief skirmish against Vietnam in 1979. The modern Chinese military has absolutely no experience in modern combined arms warfare, and to further compound China's problems, it also lacks a joint command structure amongst its various military branches like the US employs. This means that in war, it would be difficult to coordinate Chinese ground forces with their air forces or naval forces with their missile forces, etc. Given the fast pace and chaotic nature of modern war, this would leave China unable to quickly respond to and defend from threats. After the humiliation of the 1996 Taiwan Strait crisis, China began to invest heavily into its missile forces with the goal of threatening American aircraft carriers from deep within the Chinese mainland. Maintaining the world's only missile service as a separate branch of its military, China's commitment to long-range standoff weapons is not to be underestimated. Yet despite boasting that its new DF-21 carrier-killer ballistic missiles could shut the US out of the West Pacific, the truth behind these boasts is dubious at best. A ballistic missile strike on a moving target in the middle of the ocean requires a long and very complicated kill chain involving land-based radar, airborne radar, satellites, and command and control nodes to all coordinate tracking and targeting of an enemy ship, and to date, China has not displayed the capability to successfully execute every step in this complex kill chain or to protect the individual links from attack or interference. Yet even the most optimistic American naval commanders acknowledge the threat that China's ballistic missiles present to a carrier battle group, which is why the US has responded by engaging in the most ambitious ballistic missile defense program in its history, testing everything from airborne to ship-installed directed energy weapons such as lasers to a new generation of the standard model anti-air missile to classified anti-satellite weapons projects. The US has taken the Chinese ballistic missile threat very seriously. China's missile forces are its best tool for keeping the US Navy at bay, but unproven as they are, it's doubtful just how effective they would ultimately be. However, the one thing that China, and most people in the US, tend to forget about are the US's submarine forces, and that's no coincidence. Secretive by design, the US's Silent Service is the most advanced submarine force in the world, and it maintains a constant rotation of 18 subs forward deployed in the Pacific, with another 8 loitering in potential conflict zones. For the US Navy in the Pacific, this means Chinese coastal waters, and with China's very limited anti-submarine capabilities and notoriously noisy subs, this underwater force alone would be enough to choke China's trade completely and sink the entirety of China's very small amphibious assault fleet should it try to invade Taiwan. Immune to China's ballistic missile forces, America's nuclear attack submarines are its best weapon in any conflict against China, something both China and the US are keenly aware of. In response, China has installed underwater listening sensors across the South China Sea, and for its part, the US has increased annual production of its new Virginia-class submarines to 2 a year through to at least 2030. China is not yet ready to take on the US Navy and win. Yet this is a deficiency it has clearly identified and is working to address with a huge expansion of its own navy, the building of 2 aircraft carriers, and building new diesel-powered submarines. But with a looming population crisis set to explode a demographic time bomb by 2030, where over 65% of its population will be of retirement age, China may find itself pressed for the economic resources it needs to continue expanding its military. The US also faces challenges in maintaining its global peacekeeping naval fleet, but with a strong network of alliances and access to financial networks China does not, it will take some serious and very focused investment in its navy, perhaps at the expense of its other branches, for China to ever truly challenge America in the open ocean.
The United States, the world's premier military power. China, a rising power that may one day be able to challenge the US's own, but today cannot. What if these two military giants went head-to-head though, and the conflict played out on China's own shores? What if the United States decided it needed to invade China? Could China defend from a US invasion? First though, is conflict between the two even probable? The short answer is yes, and the possibility is frighteningly real and seemingly only growing more realistic by the day. Today, these two great powers find themselves locked in what historians have come to term Thucydides' trap. Thucydides was an ancient Greek historian who commented on the rise of Athens and the fall of Sparta. For a long time, Sparta was the reigning power of the Greek world, until the city-state of Athens began to rival it in terms of economy, wealth, and military power. The end result was an inevitable war between the two city-states and their allies, as one side, Sparta, sought to hold on to its spot as the #1 power, and Athens sought to dislodge it. If you think that's ancient history, then consider that out of 16 instances in just the last 500 years alone of a rising power supplanting a pre-existing power, war broke out 12 out of 16 times. Clearly, the odds are not good that the US and China can avoid war. To make matters worse, the seeds of conflict between the two nations already exist in a variety of potential flashpoints. The biggest of these are Taiwan's continued independence and China's aggressive and illegal expansion into the South Pacific. Eventually, most likely due to the matter of Taiwan, a conflict between the US and China is likely, especially if China wants to prove it really is a great power. As long as the US Navy reigns supreme in the South Pacific, China cannot claim to be a great power and cannot influence its neighbors the way it wishes to. For China, conflict with the US is all but inevitable, not just a matter of national pride, but one of continued political survival for a communist party that finds itself increasingly isolated from the outside world by growing democratic movements along its borders. So what if the worst came to worse? Could the US successfully invade China? The US's greatest asset is the presence of its forces all around the world thanks to defense agreements with partners and allies. This is a mutually beneficial agreement as it provides a boost to the hosting nation's economy and ensures its continued defense in the case of a war. For the US, though, it has the added benefit of allowing it to stage forces all around the world and quickly react to a conflict. American forces, with their wide network of military installations and partnerships with nations all over the globe, allow them a degree of flexibility and mobility that no other nation can even come close to matching. In a war against China, the US would rely on its Pacific bases to prosecute the conflict. Spurred on by China's growing aggressiveness against its neighbors in the South Pacific, President Obama launched a strategy of encirclement, much like that employed so successfully against the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Today, this means that US forces are deployed or can deploy from bases in Japan, the Philippines, Guam, South Korea, Singapore, Australia, and even Thailand. Plotted on a map, this clearly shows how American military power is posed to contain China, no matter in which direction it attempts to move its own military. The reverse is also true. The wide dispersion of US power in the South Pacific allows it to use military force against China from multiple avenues of approach, forcing Chinese defenses to spread out amongst a host of potential threat vectors. However, the primary purpose of US encirclement is not to start hostilities, but rather to respond to them or prevent them altogether. China's chief strategic problem is that it relies on overseas routes for most of its trade, with up to 60% of all Chinese trade passing through the South Pacific. Current US force predisposition has the foot in the US military poised straight on the jugular of Chinese trade, and it would not take much pressure to shut that trade off and send China into an economic collapse. In case of war, this is exactly what would happen. US forces would immediately begin a naval and air blockade of all Chinese trade, boxing in the Chinese Navy all the way from the Malacca Straits to the Sea of Japan. While the Chinese Navy now for the first time in history outnumbers the US's own Navy, it largely lacks a capability to operate far from its own shores and is best suited for coastal defense. This would make it impossible for China to send a naval expeditionary force to the Malacca Straits and secure them for its trade ships. Then there's the added complication of US allies and partners in the area who would indubitably join the US side in the conflict. Chinese ships trying to leave their territorial waters would find themselves threatened on all sides, on top of having to deal with the formidable American Pacific Fleet. At the same time that the US ships are blocking off Chinese trade, though, the People's Liberation Army rocket force would saturate US bases in Guam, South Korea, Japan, and possibly even the Philippines. These attacks would overwhelm American missile defenses and cause considerable damage, requiring weeks of repair to bring them back into operational status. This huge missile volley would greatly delay US offensive operations by both its air and naval fleets, not to mention the preparation of any sort of invasion force. However, it would also greatly anger the nations that host US forces, as missiles like the DF-21 ballistic missile have a margin of error that can be as much as several hundred meters. Missiles would be destroying not just US forces but also Japanese, South Korean, and Filipino military assets and even civilians. This would further cement support for US action against China. The Chinese missile stockpile numbers in the thousands, but it is ultimately finite, and military facilities can always be repaired faster than missile stockpile can be replenished. Not to mention that long before a second volley can be fired, US forces would have moved to heavily damage China's command and control assets. In the opening of the war, American stealth bombers would strike at Chinese long-range surveillance radar, command and control nodes, and precision military systems deep inside the country. These attacks would be mirrored by a missile barrage nearly as large as China's own being launched by America's large submarine fleet, most of which are capable of carrying long-range land attack cruise missiles. While China may be able to hold the US surface navy at bay with its rocket forces for a few weeks, possibly even a few months, the US submarine force would be impossible to target with those same rocket forces. And given China's extreme lack of anti-submarine warfare assets, the American Silent Service would all but have the run of China's coast. American stealth aircraft and submarine forces would continue striking deep into China, destroying air defense networks, satellite communication nodes, and other vital facilities for coordinating China's ability to threaten the American Navy. US stealth bomber losses would no doubt be very high. potentially knocking the entire fleet of 20 US B-2 bombers out of commission within the first few weeks. Air attacks would then have to rely on unmanned drones, supplemented by submarine cruise missile strikes. But eventually, Chinese defenses would be eroded enough to allow B-1 and even B-52 strategic bombers to begin to soften up Chinese coastal defenses. Going any further inland would likely be fatal for B-1 and B-52s, even at this stage of the war, with the Chinese Air Force suppressed but very much still capable. Escorting those non-stealthy bombers, however, would be American F-22 Raptors and F-35s, which would operate from repaired facilities in Japan and South Korea. While the US would suffer losses to both its F-22 and F-35 fleets, the loss ratio would be extremely favorable. After a few weeks of air operations, enough of China's air defenses and most of its formidable fighter aircraft would have been thinned out to allow non-stealthy US Air Force F-15s and Navy F-18s to join the fight, considerably boosting the presence of American combat aircraft. American air forces are not just more capable than China's, but considerably larger as well, with 13,264 total aircraft versus China's 3,210. Of those aircraft, the US operates nearly double as many combat aircraft as China, at 2,085 versus 1,232. To make matters worse for China, US aircraft are overwhelmingly more modern and capable, and its pilots more experienced. China may have the home field advantage, but the US would dominate the air and sea war within a few months, putting a stranglehold on China economically. In the real world, this is the limit of the US's plans for a war with China: destroy its Navy and Air Force and strangle it economically into submission. In today's scenario, though, we're taking this a step further. Preparation for an invasion of China would take many months and require the mustering of most of the US's amphibious forces. If the US wanted to gather an invasion force and maintain its global commitments as they stand today, it would need to institute a national draft, which could potentially see it add up to 145 million additional personnel to its military. However, China's 1.3 billion strong population could muster up a defensive force of 753 million. Though with its much smaller military budget, a floundering economy due to the US's stranglehold on its trade, and damage on its infrastructure caused by American air and naval attacks, China would only realistically be able to train up and equip a small percentage of this number. Likewise, the US would only be able to equip a small percentage of its own reservists, leaving the numbers advantage firmly in Chinese hands. The US has always had the capability to move forces around in large numbers relatively fast, but in recent years it's greatly increased its expeditionary capabilities, adding a number of mobile landing platforms, afloat forward staging bases, and amphibious assault ships. Today, the US maintains 3 Marine Expeditionary Forces, its primary force dedicated to kicking down the door on hostile beaches all over the world. Each force can bring to an enemy's shore between 20,000 and 90,000 Marines and sailors. These would quickly be supplemented by US Army Expeditionary Forces, though they would require longer to assemble, prepare, and transport to a hostile Chinese beach. Initially, the American Marines would be forced to hold the beach alone, though they would not be able to land in their full numbers all at the same time. Not wishing to spread themselves too thin, and with US air and naval power only capable of carving out a very small slice of safety on hostile Chinese beaches, US forces may at best approach the numbers of the amphibious assault in Normandy, averaging between 15,000 and 20,000 personnel per day. This would require a full 3.5 days for an entire Marine Expeditionary Force to make the beach. This would leave 20,000 Marines with the unenviable task of holding a narrow strip of beach against a People's Liberation Army of around 975,000, not counting reservists and conscripts. Even with air superiority achieved, US and Allied aircraft could not hope to hold at bay the vast number of Chinese ground troops, and it's likely that even before the first Marine Expeditionary Force could completely offload onto the beach, the Marines holding them would have been thrown back out into the ocean. Sheer numbers alone make an invasion of the Chinese mainland completely impossible for even the technologically superior US, and it would require the unloading of an entire Marine Expeditionary Force in one single landing to secure a foothold against the vast numbers of the Chinese People's Liberation Army. This is precisely why the United States has no plans of invading China, and instead plans on simply destroying the Chinese Navy and Air Force while blockading it economically in the case of war. All eyes are on the Russian bear as it marches across Eastern Europe. But is the bigger threat to the world hiding in the East? Is China actually plotting to take over the world? As a president famously said, that depends on your definition of is. There's no question that China is a massive world power, In fact, depending on your standards, it might be only the second superpower in the world after the United States. It's the most populous country in the world, with over 4 times the population of the US. It has the second largest economy of the world, the third largest country in size behind Russia and Canada, and is one of only a small number of nuclear powers in the world. It's certainly the biggest power in Asia, and it might have much bigger ambitions than that. But what are China's actual plans for the world? To find that out, you can look close to home. The province of Hong Kong, which was a British territory for decades, was handed back to China in 1997 after negotiations which created a plan of one country, two systems. Hong Kong would be allowed to maintain its autonomy and run itself as a democracy, while China would administer certain larger affairs, and it would officially be part of the larger country. That was the system for a while, until China decided it wasn't anymore, and the People's Republic of China has been tightening the screws ever since. And China has been through plenty of changes itself. Since China became a communist country in 1949 under Mao Zedong, it's been a dictatorship, but Mao's strict adherence to the communist dogma, which led to brutal famines and repression, have long since been replaced with a very different system under Deng Xiaoping and the current leader Xi Jinping. The country kept its autocratic system of government while replacing its economic policies with a sort of hybrid government-controlled capitalism. Under this system, China's economy has exploded and has become one of the world's largest producers of electronics, appliances, and mined rare earth minerals essential for manufacturing. But in other ways, China's modernization did not bring good things. While China is only loosely a communist country now, their security state is still very similar to what it was under Mao, only with a high-tech twist. In the modern age, governments use the internet heavily to gain intelligence on potential threats. That's true in China and in most other countries, with powerful tech companies turning over information to the government as needed. In China, websites like TikTok contain extensive tracking software that the Chinese government uses for unknown purposes. And internally, China has become notorious for its social credit system. This ranks citizens based on their perceived loyalty to the government and their conduct in other ways, with various privileges being granted only to those with higher social credit scores. And if you're under China's thumb, there is little you can do to escape. Hong Kong was given guarantees of a certain level of autonomy for a specific term, but in recent years those guarantees have been largely overrun. While they still have separate elections, Chinese authorities increasingly interfere in them and disqualify or arrest candidates who oppose the People's Republic's policies. This often leads to largely unopposed elections, and the recent COVID shutdowns led to China getting even more directly involved in shutting down protests and public gatherings. So, if you're inside China, you're probably kept under a pretty tight grip. But what if you're outside it? That depends on where you are, because China has been involved in a territorial conflict near its borders for almost 70 years now. When the People's Republic of China took control, it was in the middle of a brutal civil war. The Communists ultimately won, but the forces of the Republic of China managed to consolidate their forces on the island of Taiwan and hold it, essentially creating a new country there. The only problem is, China still refuses to recognize Taiwan as an independent country. In fact, while they claim they're the legitimate government of Taiwan, the Taiwanese government, now a democracy, still claims it's the rightful government of mainland China. But the People's Republic has much more power, and they've managed to use diplomatic pressure to prevent international recognition of Taiwan as a United Nations member state. And they're not afraid to punch back against big targets. China takes it as a personal offense when anyone recognizes Taiwan as being independent, even if that person isn't actually the head of a country. That's why most US politicians have avoided paying visits to Taiwan in the last few decades, to avoid causing any diplomatic crises for the president. But in 2022, Speaker Nancy Pelosi and some other members of Congress decided to make a visit to the island nation, and China responded hard. They stepped up military drills around the island, terrorizing the citizens, and one Chinese propagandist even said the country should shoot down Pelosi's plane. While clearly that would have started a hot war between China and the US, and cooler heads prevailed, it was clear China was willing to escalate in a hurry. But is China all talk and no action? That depends on where you look. While they get a lot of attention for their over-the-top online personality, with colorful propagandists spreading conspiracy theories and trying to meme, they actually do maintain a very strong deterrent against international criticism. And it's one Russia is fond of as well. China's justice system is notoriously harsh, with long sentences and the death penalty on the table for many crimes, far more than murder or treason. And while most of the people in Chinese prisons are Chinese, they have commonly arrested people from other countries for the purpose of prisoner exchanges. When the CEO of Chinese company Huawei was arrested in Canada, it wasn't long before a Canadian citizen was arrested in China on drug charges. but China's reach is growing fast. No one knows exactly what China's long-term plans are. The People's Republic has made many claims about invading Taiwan, and they're no doubt looking closely at Russia and Ukraine to see how that would go. But it's not going well for Russia. Most of the world has committed to supporting Ukraine with military and financial backing, and Russia has found itself increasingly isolated and sanctioned. While Taiwan isn't universally acknowledged as an independent country the same way Ukraine was, the United States has promised to defend it. So any sort of hot war on the island would likely escalate quickly with potential nuclear consequences. So China might be taking a slower, more global approach. China's internet efforts go far beyond an army of internet trolls, and they might just be becoming the world's most premier cyber hacking organization. While they're certainly not sharing the details of their operations, it's believed that they have 3 divisions of cyber warriors: specialized military forces that train in cyber attacks and work on behalf of the government, state workers who aren't in the military but are tasked with cyber warfare and spying, and a group of non-government workers who are likely hired by the government and have more deniability when they need to break into rival governments' networks. And they've caused a lot of damage. Who has China hacked? Who haven't they hacked? Countless countries have claimed that Chinese hackers have taken classified data. Australia claimed that a 2013 attack accessed the blueprints of their intelligence headquarters, while Canada reported in 2011 an attack compromised multiple federal departments. Japan has reported at least 200 cyber attacks on Japanese companies and scientific institutes, while China's frequent rival India reported multiple denial-of-service attacks that may have come from agents of the Chinese government. Ukraine reported attacks during the opening days of the war, maybe China acting on behalf of Russia, and even the Vatican reported hacking attacks. The US has been the top target of Chinese cyber attacks for a long time, with reports of attacks on military, government, commercial, and industrial organizations. Even the largest companies in the world aren't safe. Google was hacked in 2010 and reported that the privacy of its users was compromised. They also went after massive companies like military contractor Northrop Grumman and manufacturing giant Dow Chemical. An attack on Yahoo might have had less implications for national security, but they probably got a good look at your mom's emails, including that extended exchange with a Nigerian prince. So what does China actually want with all this data? Well, if you ask them, they'd say, "We don't know what you're talking about. No cyber hacking here," as they proceed to hack another company. And because China refuses to fess up to its cyber hacking efforts, it's hard to say what they're actually after. While they hack private companies, it might be Chinese-style capitalism at work, stealing trade secrets so they can give them to their own companies, allowing them to produce lower-cost remakes of major US products, giving them a leg up in the market. They may also be looking for key access to diplomatic cables in their hacking of government institutions, but cybersecurity experts worry about a much bigger threat. If China knows how to get into the mainframes of major companies and government institutions, then they might be looking for a way to turn them off. And if they were ever to initiate war over Taiwan or another country, being able to kneecap the US's military and civilian infrastructure at exactly the right moment could give them the edge they need to finish the job. But is China actually planning a big move? If they are, they've been putting their pieces on the board for a long time. China has a long reach in Asia that goes far beyond Taiwan and Hong Kong. They unilaterally claim sovereignty over the entire South China Sea, which puts them into conflict with Indonesia, the Philippines, Vietnam, and other countries. China's claim means that they have the authority to stop intelligence-gathering activities by foreign militaries in the sea, which has led to multiple near misses between Chinese aircraft and those of other countries. The Hague ruled in favor of the Philippines during a recent dispute, and China's response was to reiterate its claims and continue its campaign of harassment. So why does China want this territory so much? Some people think it's just maximalism. After all, if you claim the sea surrounding a bunch of countries, it's really not a big reach to then claim those countries. But the ocean itself is incredibly valuable, with an estimated 11 billion barrels of untapped oil and almost 200 trillion cubic feet of natural gas hiding far below the waves. If China manages to get the world to accept their authority over these islands, they would have a huge leg up in energy production, something they very much need with their massive population and energy needs. This area also has multiple highly sought-after fishing areas, which would give China the food it needs without having to rely on imports. And more importantly, they would control access to the food of many poorer countries who would have no choice but to align with them. And when you can't find a beachhead, why not make one? China has been known to take over small islands in the South China Sea, but they've started taking another approach, building artificial islands in the South China Sea that let them create unchallenged military staging grounds. These islands are typically built on rocks or reefs that are close to the surface of the water. After dredging the area to create a more solid floor, they're covered with harder material and turned into small military bases. This turns the disputed sea area into what's de facto Chinese territory and serves as an act of intimidation against any other country that tries to set foot in the area. But is China a threat to the region? So far, China seems to be trying to win through soft power rather than open military action. They're hands down the biggest military power in the region, which means that any other country is likely to back down when directly challenged. While North Korea and India are also nuclear powers, North Korea is typically aligned with China, and India is preoccupied by its conflict with Pakistan. China's tensest relations in the region are with Vietnam, which it fought wars with previously. Now the two communist countries have hit rough waters, with China increasingly encroaching on Vietnam's coastline in the South China Sea while harassing Vietnamese ships. In 2014, China began building an oil rig deep within Vietnam's ocean territory. China seems to be making itself a regional power through sheer force of will, but elsewhere it's taking a very different approach. There's no continent more open to realignment than Africa, historically the subject of colonialism, occupation, and a brutal slave trade. Many of its nations only gained independence in the 20th century, often at the conclusion of bloody wars. Now, while many of the countries do have good diplomatic relations with Europe and North America, there are naturally old wounds to heal. And that's why China sees the continent as a massive opportunity for expansion. But this time, they're not looking to intimidate their way into a seat at the table. They're looking to buy their way in. Chinese investments in Africa have gained a lot of attention in recent years as the country moves many of its manufacturing efforts there. Africa is far away from China's expansionist actions in the South China Sea, and as such, many African countries are neutral to China. So when a Chinese firm shows up looking to build a factory there, they're likely to be approved. And China knows how to sweeten the deal. They'll frequently build new housing or other infrastructure as part of their investment, creating potential loyalists down the line should the world divide between China and the US. And for China, investing in Africa just makes sense. Many people see Africa as the future of the world. Not only is the population of the region expected to double in the next 30 years, the highest growth of any continent, but 7 of the world's 10 fastest growing economies are located there. That makes Africa the world's best place for future investments. And China has made it clear that they're not just restoring the old dynamic of Africa being used as a looting ground for world powers. They frequently staff their companies with African workers, providing jobs to the local economy, although they tend to be low-skill and low-paid jobs, while Chinese figures hold the higher positions. But is this good or bad for Africa? Some worry that China is setting Africa up for what's called a debt trap, where they invest heavily in a country in exchange for promises of repayment of the investment, only for the profits to never come and the country to be stuck in a state of limbo. That hasn't happened so far, as it doesn't seem like China simply wants to extract resources or money from Africa. They view it as a diplomatic investment as well. China wants to control the tech infrastructure in these countries, bringing industry to many of them for the first time. If China was to go to war with the United States and NATO, those countries would find themselves potentially cut off from a massive infrastructure network as China had commandeered it. One of the biggest concerns about this effort is that the heavy industrialization in African countries is hurting their environment, but the governments in most countries seem excited for the investment. But is there a longer plan at work here? China seems to have a hand in just about every region, similar to the other superpowers of the past and present. For Europe and North America, they mostly have cautious diplomacy and an aggressive cyber-hacking strategy to gain intelligence. For their neighbors in Asia, they approach with belligerence and flex their muscles to claim territory. But for nations in the so-called Third World, there's often an outstretched hand instead, offering heavy investments and possibly an alliance against the older powerhouses of the world. And some think this might be all coming together for China to make a big move. Many people have said the 21st century could be a Chinese century, with the country's economy growing by leaps and bounds. But they've been hit hard by their efforts to contain the COVID-19 pandemic, leading to economic slowdowns. Additionally, they've lost many diplomatic allies in the West due to their aggressive military tactics and their domestic policies, particularly their internment of the massive Uyghur Muslim population and their treatment of other minority groups like Buddhists and the Falun Gong movement. That's kept their growth in check, with many Western countries becoming more hesitant to invest heavily there. Which then leads people to worry, are they biding their time for a military move? China is incredibly powerful militarily, maybe the second strongest military in the world. While Russia has the most nuclear weapons of any country, its weapons are old and unreliable to the point where no one knows how many would even fire. China's estimated to have only 350 nuclear weapons, a far smaller arsenal than the US, but every single one of them is in working order, and many are attached to powerful missiles that could hit just about anywhere in the world. They're also one of only a few countries to have aircraft carriers, and their naval and aerial fleets are believed to be competitive with the US's fleet. but their biggest weapon might be how prepared they are. So if China was planning to actually take over the world, how would they go about it? The first step would likely to be to plan with some other countries. China has become one of Russia's few remaining allies since the war with Ukraine, helping them get around sanctions and providing vital economic help. So if China wanted to make its own move on Taiwan, or a much bigger plan, it would likely pull in Russia for help. A coordinated attack on several targets might be much harder to coordinate, and they might have a third partner as well, North Korea, run by the infamous Kim Jong-un. Like China and Taiwan, North Korea has never accepted the independence of South Korea, even after 70 years. A three-pronged attack like this might take the world by surprise. But would they actually win? In terms of a full military invasion, we've seen how Russia has performed, and North Korea has never been tested against a military outside its peninsula. But China's naval fleet is fearsome, and many believe it could fight the US fleet to a standstill in the Pacific. And when you have two nuclear powers standing off shooting at each other, there's always the risk of escalation. China could not win a nuclear war with the US, but a major nuclear exchange would likely mean neither country is left standing. So China is hoping to avoid nuclear war, and it might have a plan to do so. Could China win a war without firing a shot? This might be where China's cyber hacking infrastructure comes into play. Unlike other military attacks, hackers don't announce themselves. They sneak in under the cover of darkness. Imagine if one morning America woke up and nothing was working. The internet was down, smart devices were malfunctioning, and even the government's connections weren't working. They spend hours getting things up and running, and tune into the news to find out that Chinese warships are shelling Taiwan. Their military has established beachheads in Vietnam and the Philippines, and North Korea has crossed the DMZ. While the fighting is far from over, China has declared their invasion successful and says that any interference from the US would be an invasion of their territory. Surely the United States would arm up, right? Not so fast. Maybe China calls in its chips with Africa and cuts the US off from several key suppliers. Supply chain issues are a bane of Russia in the Ukraine war, and the United States might now face the same problem. China would have cut off its supplies, as will any country aligned with it. More critical, and occupied Taiwan would no longer provide America with the key semiconductors it needs to operate much of its technology, and the United States would have to think twice before expanding key military technology. While South Korea's fearsome military would likely be able to hold off North Korea for a long time, and China would likely rein in the North to keep them from using nuclear weapons, it's unlikely that Taiwan or Southeast Asian nations could hold out too long without support. But is this where China would want to stop? Taking over much of Asia has been China's goal for a long time, and if this plan would work, it would have pulled it off without getting bogged down in a global conflict. This would firmly entrench it as a superpower and make the United States look toothless. More countries would be looking to align with China, and that includes India. China's goal would likely to be to turn India into a regional client state rather than actively trying to conquer it. And with Pakistan on one side and China on the other, they could put a lot of pressure on the subcontinent. Smaller nations in the region would likely choose to align with China for protection, and China's next big step would be to expand further out into the Pacific. Many small island nations there could be pressured into signing deals, giving the Chinese free rein in exchange for protection, and that might bring China into direct conflict with the United States. While most Pacific islands are independent nations by now, the United States has several territories, including Guam and American Samoa. While they're unlikely to try to annex any of them outright, at least at this stage, they would likely start treating them in a similar way to the way they did Vietnam initially. They would just step on their sovereignty as much as they want and dare them to respond. Would the United States tolerate this? That depends on the political climate at the time. How much hunger does the US have for a conflict with a rival superpower? Does the public agree with defending these islands, or do they leave them to their fate? If they're left to their fate, that's another blow against the United States' standing in the world. And the next on the chopping block is Hawaii, an actual state but located thousands of miles away from the mainland. With a strong independence movement, could China make inroads there? So China's plan may not be to conquer the world in a shock and awe military campaign against the most powerful armies in the world. It might simply be planning to expand its power and influence piece by piece until it stands alone as the most powerful superpower in the world. It's late February earlier this year, and somewhere above the Spratly Islands in the South China Sea, a U.S. Navy P-8 Poseidon aircraft is conducting routine surveillance of Chinese ships and installations along the group of remote reefs and man-made artificial islands. These islands have been built by China over the last 2 decades, as the nation lays claim to what it calls territorial waters, despite the fact that this territory is hundreds of miles from the Chinese coast and has been declared illegal by an international court ruling at The Hague. China, however, rejected the ruling and continued to build up its military presence on these faraway islands, reclaiming land from the ocean and building runways long enough to accommodate Chinese warplanes, radar and radar jamming installations, and missile batteries. With the international community rejecting China's illegal claim to the area, the United States has routinely engaged in surveillance and freedom of navigation exercises in order to delegitimize the Chinese claim and to keep tabs on the military developments in the area. Today, a Navy Poseidon spy plane is approaching one of these artificial islands when, from thousands of feet below it, a Chinese Navy destroyer suddenly targets the American plane. Using an extremely powerful military-grade laser, the destroyer aims straight at the cockpit, sending dazzling light into the aircraft and temporarily blinding the pilots. Undeterred, the U.S. plane continues its mission, but for a brief moment the world hung on the edge of its next major war. This incident is incredibly not a rare case, as U.S. ships and planes have pursued freedom of navigation exercises and intelligence-gathering missions in the area. They've been routinely intercepted by Chinese ships and planes. But why is this going on, and how could it lead to World War III? Since 1947, China has laid claim to what it calls territorial waters within a 9-dash line created by the Chinese government at the time. This extends from the southern Chinese coast almost 1,000 miles all the way out to the coast of Borneo and extends to Vietnam and the Philippines coast as well. The claim is not just illegal but incredibly ludicrous. It would be like the United States claiming territorial waters, the entirety of the Gulf of Mexico, all the way to Venezuela. China, however, is undeterred, and in the early 2000s began a campaign of island building by reclaiming land from the ocean and building upon pre-existing reefs. This was a first attempt to legitimize its claims, as no nation can claim water around an island feature unless that island can be proven to support human life. China's answer was to shortcut that clause in international maritime law by creating an island where one didn't exist, and then setting up troop barracks and flying in supplies. Surrounded by neighbors much weaker than itself, while the island-building actions were condemned, they weren't challenged militarily. The last time a nation had dared to stand up to China was in 1988, when Vietnamese forces were dispatched to drive away Chinese incursion into an island within their own economic exclusion zone. A confrontation between Vietnam and the Chinese led to China killing over 60 Vietnamese Marines and destroying 3 Vietnamese Navy ships. China officially occupied the reef and has held it ever since. A similar incident was in the making later in 1994 with the Philippines, but the Philippine government, remembering the killing of Vietnamese Marines and sailors by the Chinese, decided to back down and allow China to occupy features within its own territorial waters. But why does China want this massive amount of ocean territory even when it's so far from home? Well, that's because this area of the world is relatively underdeveloped by the gas and oil industry and is home to some of the world's largest energy reserves that are still relatively untapped, rivaled only by the waters around the North Pole. The U.S. Energy Information Agency estimates that there are around 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas and 11 billion barrels of oil in the area, with a 2012 U.S. Geological Survey estimating that an additional 160 trillion cubic feet of natural gas and 12 billion barrels of oil are still undiscovered. This equates to trillions of dollars in untapped wealth, and China is willing to go to any lengths to ensure it gets it. To add to the economic prize of the region, the area is also home to some of the world's largest remaining fisheries, and Chinese fishing vessels are already plundering the territorial waters of the nations that ring the South China Sea. These fishing vessels have used water cannons to force the fishing ships of other nations away, and with Chinese Navy warships never far away, so far nobody has bothered to fight back. Only the United States has the military might to challenge China's illegal claims, and it has done so repeatedly. Undertaking what is internationally known as freedom of navigation exercises, U.S. ships and planes have routinely moved through the waters that the Chinese military claim as its own around the many artificial islands China has built in the region. Under normal international law, military warships of other nations must pass through the territorial water of a sovereign nation as quickly as possible through the most expedient route possible. The U.S., in a bid to delegitimize the claims by China, has instead opted to sail its ships in a zigzag pattern through the disputed waters, purposefully not sailing as expeditiously as possible, nor taking the most direct route possible. This places China in a difficult position as it can't legitimately claim national sovereignty when the warships of another nation flagrantly disregard that sovereignty. And unlike the small fleets of Vietnam, Borneo, Malaysia, the Philippines, or Burma, the US Navy isn't so easily bullied away by Chinese ships. Instead, China has been forced to respond with everything short of outright force, often shadowing US ships with its own or intercepting US Navy planes on approach to the illegal bases China has built in the region. While so far this hasn't led to a serious incident, thanks on the part by restraint exercised on both sides, this year's laser flashing incident was indicative of China's willingness to push the issue with potentially catastrophic results. Had the US pilots been physically looking in the direction of the laser flash, the high-powered beam could have permanently damaged the vision of the aviators, potentially putting the entire aircraft at risk. So what if the US Navy had lost the entire crew of a P-8 Poseidon? For the US, that would have meant the death of at least 9 American sailors, as each P-8 carries mission support crew including intelligence personnel handling many of the plane's extremely sensitive instruments. With US ships in the region already on high alert around Chinese installation and ships, the loss of an entire aircraft to direct hostile action by China could have immediate consequences. In all likelihood, the US would attempt to use restraint and authorize only a tit-for-tat response, likely targeting and destroying an expensive but unmanned Chinese military installation along the disputed island chains. If instead the Navy P-8 had been shot down by actual Chinese weapons, and not just accidentally downed by blinding the pilots, the response would be far different. The US faces a very serious choice. If it refuses to take retributive action, then it threatens to at last fully legitimize Chinese claims to the area, not to mention lose major international face as it essentially bows to China as the superior Pacific power. This is, well, unlikely to say the least, and an actual shoot-down of a US plane by Chinese forces would likely lead to an overwhelming military response. That response, however, would be limited to the specific installation the attack originated from in a bid to allow China the option of not escalating the conflict into all-out war. China would have to accept the loss of what would likely be several missile batteries and a radar and communication station, along with the men manning those resources, or it could choose to escalate the conflict. Escalation would be unlikely, however, as, simply put, the US is by far the superior power in the Pacific. While China can threaten US forces with a large stockpile of ballistic missiles, its Navy is simply no match for the firepower of the US Navy. And most importantly, China has not yet demonstrated that it has the ability to keep its targeting networks for its ballistic missile forces operational past first contact with American forces. Even if, somehow, China's ballistic missile kill chain remains intact, an extremely dubious proposition, its total stockpile is limited, and once those missiles run out, it will be up to the Chinese Navy to fend off the US's Pacific forces, which would by then be bolstered by ships from the Atlantic Fleet. This is a task it is simply not equipped to undertake. Further complicating problems for China is the US's vast fleet of submarines, an asset that is routinely overlooked by military planners on both sides, and that's something that the US's silent service, as it's known, is more than happy with. With an extremely limited anti-submarine warfare capability, China's Navy would be decimated by this undersea fleet, and with the vast majority of its trade coming through the ocean, an economic blockade of China would lead to a catastrophic consequence for the nation. In the end, it's in the best interest of both sides that no such conflict takes place. While the US would doubtlessly emerge victorious, it would be a costly victory with the greatest losses the Navy will have endured since World War II. With China as its greatest trading partner, the US economy would take a huge hit as well. Though unlike China, the US could redirect much commerce elsewhere. Still, a fully armed confrontation between the two nations would have dire consequences for the world, and is not a proposition either side wants to see. And yet, China continues to build upon and expand on what detractors have taken to calling landlocked aircraft carriers in the South China Sea, unwilling to obey international law and continuing to bully its neighbors. This leaves not just the fate of the South Pacific, but the very peace and stability it currently enjoys hanging in the balance, and this time, it's China whose actions will determine what the history books say about war in the 21st century. If this scenario seems far-fetched, perhaps it's not as far off as one might think, as an armed confrontation very nearly occurred between the US and China back in 2001. On April 1st of that year, a US Navy reconnaissance aircraft was operating near yet another disputed Chinese encampment, this time on the Parcel Islands. when it was intercepted by two Chinese J-8 fighters. In a bid to intimidate the Americans, one of the J-8 pilots undertook two high-speed flybys of the big U.S. plane. But on the third attempt, the pilot completely misjudged his skills and rammed straight into the American EP-3E. The impact split the J-8 into two pieces and severely damaged the American plane, which was sent to an uncontrolled dive. Incredibly, the American pilot was able to recover the aircraft, and severely damaged, it immediately sent a distress signal to a nearby Chinese airfield. The Chinese ignored 15 distress calls, and finally, the American plane simply decided to land on the Chinese runway regardless of permission or not, as the pilot did not believe he could keep the plane aloft any longer. The only casualties of the incident was the Chinese pilot, who was likely crushed to death on impact and unable to eject. Immediately after the incident, and despite the U.S. releasing flight data from the onboard recorder, China claimed that it was the U.S. plane that caused the collision by purposefully turning into the passing Chinese plane. This claim was in short ludicrous and largely ignored by the international community, especially since China never released the flight data from its own aircraft black box. Things in the South China Sea remain tense, and a major incident between the two nations is only one provocation away. What happens next is largely in China's hands, but one thing is for sure: it is unlikely to back down from its claims in the South China Sea, and sadly, conflict seems likely. In a recent press interview, President Joe Biden confirmed that United States men and women would fight to defend Taiwan from a Chinese invasion. This prompted immediate outrage from China, who claimed the U.S. was violating its own One China policy. In response, President Biden ordered U.S. and Canadian warships to sail through the Taiwan Strait. For decades, the U.S. operated under a strategic ambiguity in regards to Taiwan, never truly committing to its defense, but strongly hinting that it would oppose a Chinese invasion with military force of its own. This had served as a diplomatic lubricant between the U.S. and China, as China sees reunification with Taiwan as a matter of not just national pride, but of survival for the Chinese Communist Party. A free and independent Taiwan is a direct affront to Chinese attempts to become a global superpower, something it has yet to achieve. If the nation can't neutralize one renegade province right off its own shores, it'll never be able to be a credible global power. For the CCP, Taiwan's democracy is an existential threat on their own grip on Chinese power. Now, President Biden has said the quiet part out loud, and China can expect to face U.S. forces if it attempts to invade Taiwan. But just what would the U.S. do in case of an invasion? A Chinese invasion of Taiwan could only take place during the 2 or 3 week window in either spring or fall, when the tides are favorable. Chinese forces could also only land on a limited number of beaches suitable for the offloading of infantry and vehicles, and all of these are highly defended and booby-trapped in advance. Further, an invasion would take months to prepare, giving Taiwan ample warning and allowing its Navy time to mine the Taiwan Strait. It would be the most costly military operation in terms of life and resources since the great battles of World War II, and even without the U.S. aid, China is unlikely to succeed despite its overwhelming size advantage. Much like the Greeks at Thermopylae, Taiwan is in a strategically superior position that allows its smaller forces to fend off China's hordes. In case of war, the U.S. response would be by air and sea, and it's unlikely the U.S. ground forces would come into play at all in the fighting. However, it's not impossible that U.S. Marine and Army forces could be committed to the defense of the small island in small numbers to bolster Taiwan's defenders. The first thing that would happen in case of a war is American submarines would begin their deadly work of decimating Chinese vessels. Despite an increasing capability in anti-submarine warfare, China's ASW abilities are still lacking, and U.S. submarines are very good at remaining hidden. The American Silent Service would be tasked with ambushing Chinese vessels attempting to navigate the Taiwan Strait, striking with surgical precision at troop transports and support ships, which would be more valuable kills given their limited numbers than actual warships. If China can't move troops and equipment across the strait, it can't invade after all. The Taiwan Strait would be a perilous place for any vessel to operate in, and U.S. submarine losses would occur, but losses on the Chinese side would be significantly higher. Up north, just south of Russia's Kamchatka Peninsula, a single American Ohio-class submarine converted to carry cruise missiles would launch a devastating attack against the oil pipeline connecting China to Russia. This would leave China with only one route for oil to take over land into the nation, throttling down China's oil supply. Oil would be the key to victory, as any modern economy requires it to function. China, however, is extremely vulnerable to trade disruption. This is largely the reason that the U.S. has paid little heed to China's threats. Approximately 60% of China's trade, including oil, travels by the sea, and this is China's Achilles heel. The nation might have the world's largest navy, but largest doesn't mean most capable, and China's navy has some serious deficiencies. For starters, its numbers are greatly inflated by smaller missile boats, and it lacks the logistical or defensive capabilities to send its ships far from its own shores. This means that while China's navy could operate around Taiwan's territorial waters, sending them much farther out to sea than that would be a deadly mistake. This is a situation that China has tried to rectify by expanding its influence in the South China Sea via artificial islands. These man-made floating airfields are packed to the brim with long-range missiles and attack aircraft, but they simply can't do enough to protect China's overseas trade. That's because any ship bringing oil to China must pass through the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean, giving the United States 2 choke points to strangle China to death economically. Even before hostilities broke out, U.S. naval forces would be moving toward the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean. American warships stationed right outside the Gulf of Oman would act as a first line of denial to Chinese oil shipping. To the east, the Straits of Malacca would be cut off to Chinese ships by the U.S. Pacific Fleet. The end result is a near-total oil embargo on China that would leave it reliant on its own western overland pipes from Russia, which are, for the moment, out of reach of U.S. weapons. However, it's not unthinkable that in case of war, the U.S. wouldn't fly B-2 stealth bombers north through India to strike at these connections with standoff munitions. With very frosty relations between India and China, India is very likely to allow U.S. bombers to operate in its airspace for the mission. Even without striking these oil pipelines, though, China's oil imports would be reduced to a trickle, having immediate repercussions for its economy that would only worsen over time. If you've ever wondered why China hasn't actually invaded Taiwan yet, it's largely because the United States Navy has its foot on China's throat, and it would require minimal pressure to choke the country to death economically. U.S. carriers would doubtlessly join the fight in the skies over Taiwan, although to be honest, U.S. forces never need engage China if they simply carry out a blockade strategy. The only reason U.S. Air Forces would engage Chinese forces would be to carry out America's chief objectives in case of a war with China, the destruction of its air and naval forces so as to neutralize it as a future threat. Flying from airfields in South Korea and Japan, U.S. Air Force fighters could join the fight over Taiwan with the aid of aerial tankers, and operating out of aircraft carriers in the Pacific, U.S. Navy aviators would also be on the front lines against Chinese forces. However, American carriers would be under serious threat from Chinese ballistic missile attack, and that's why the U.S. Navy is working to greatly expand the combat radius of its fighters. The Navy's next-generation fighter, already in development, has a strict requirement of a combat range increase of up to 50%. Meaning the airframe will have to be significantly larger than the current F-18 Hornet or F-35. However, in the meantime, the Navy's also developing a fleet of drone tanker aircraft that can accompany fighters and top them off right before entering combat ranges. This would help put U.S. ships out of range of most, but not all, of China's long-range missiles. But it's at best a stopgap measure, as missile technology will continue to evolve, giving the weapons longer and longer ranges. Yet the U.S. remains confident it can operate its carriers in the Pacific in case of war. Fleet air defense vessels such as the Aegis cruisers can take on ballistic missiles with their complement of SM-3 missiles, which intercept ballistic missiles outside of Earth's atmosphere. To aid in their own defense, U.S. carriers are fast, very fast vessels for their size, with a publicly listed top speed of 35 miles per hour. However, it's a well-known fact that American supercarriers can move significantly faster than this when required, with a top speed that's classified. 35 miles an hour might not sound like much, but when you're targeting a vessel hundreds of miles from your launch site, this means that by the time your weapon nears the vessel's original coordinates, it's long gone. This is why modern long-range munitions require very robust surveillance, tracking, and targeting capabilities in the form of drones, AWACS aircraft, undersea sensors, and satellites, amongst others. Each of these assets forms one link in a long kill chain where platforms feed targeting data to an incoming missile. While China has made great leaps and bounds in its ability to hit U.S. ships at sea, it remains to be seen if China's kill chains can survive hostile contact with the U.S. forces. This by no means U.S. supercarriers are safe, and the platform is likely an outdated concept that we should very strongly consider scrapping in favor of more smaller carriers that leave the U.S. Navy less vulnerable to overwhelming losses from a single attack. Once American fighters are in the air, China will find itself facing the most advanced aerospace forces in the world. But this does not make U.S. planes invulnerable. In fact, China fields a longer-range air-to-air missile than the U.S. currently does, the PL-15. This missile has a slightly greater range than the American AIM-120D AMRAAM, giving Chinese fighters the advantage in a first-look, first-shoot confrontation. This is set to change in the next few years as the U.S. fields the AIM-260, which has a classified range but is believed to reach at least 186 miles, which is the range China's own next-generation missile, the PL-21, is expected to have. However, to actually hit U.S. fighters, China must detect them first, and this is why the U.S. spearhead will be its fleet of 5th-generation stealth aircraft. While not invisible to enemy radar, China's frontline fighters currently can't target American F-35s and F-22s until they're within approximately 35 miles, which eliminates China's slight edge in long-range air-to-air missiles. American fighters would be opening fire well before China's knew they were there. But stealth comes with a serious vulnerability, a lack of payload capacity. Flying in stealth configuration, a US F-35 is limited to 4 AIM-120s and 2 Sidewinders. This does not bode well given the fact that China would be committing dozens of aircraft at a time to the fight. While US stealth fighters would be able to knock out China's front fighter screens, it's unlikely they'd be able to penetrate deep enough to strike at Chinese bombers, launching devastating standoff attacks against Taiwanese targets. To do so, US fighters would have to fly in murder configuration, fully loaded with missiles on wing pylons and thus destroying their stealth signature. China has its own stealth fighters for the US to worry about. The Chengdu J-20 is an inferior 5th-generation fighter, the bottom of the pile when compared to the F-22, F-35, and Russia's Su-57. It has decidedly non-stealthy features such as canards and engine outlets, and it's believed that it uses inferior radar-absorbent materials in its construction. To boot, China operates only about 150 of these aircraft, meaning they're in limited supply. Yet even inferior stealth is still stealth, and Chinese J-20s would pose a serious threat to American air support assets, such as tankers and AWACS, both critical platforms badly needed for modern air campaigns. Armed with long-range PL-15s, J-20s could easily stay out of detection of American AWACS and fire their missiles, all but certainly bringing these valuable air assets down. To date, the US does not have a firm solution to this problem, which would be magnified by the fact that Chinese aircraft would be operating so close to home and thus within easy range of ground and naval-based air defenses. The battle in the sky over Taiwan would turn to one of attrition, which the US would inevitably win over time, but not without taking significant losses of even its precious 5th-generation fighters. The sooner the American public accepts that the F-22 and F-35 are not invulnerable, the better position America will be to accept combat losses and continue to muster the will to fight, because China would be looking to knock the US out of the fight not by military might, but by eroding public support for the war. After 20 years of disastrous adventurism in the Middle East, the American people have little stomach for yet another protracted military campaign against a foe that isn't necessarily threatening them directly. It's China's hope that it can cut the knees out from under America by inflicting large losses and shocking the American people. Yet, defending Taiwan is of critical national defense importance to the United States. Allowing the island nation to fall to China would severely undermine U.S. dominance of the Pacific, as it would give China the ability to break what's known as the First Island Chain of Containment. This is a chain of islands that hems China in from Japan down to the Philippines and has served as a barrier to Chinese naval expansion into the Pacific. Taiwan, however, is important to the U.S. and to the entire free world for another reason. Right now, the island nation supplies much of the world's supply of microchips and other computer components. Allowing this manufacturing capability to fall into the hands of the Chinese means that along with its own production capability, China would become the largest global supplier of these components critical to modern industry and militaries both. The Taiwanese embargo alone was a crippling blow to Russia's ability to manufacture new precision munitions. With China in control of the world's computer component manufacturing, it would effectively give the nation the ability to blackmail any other nation in the world and bully it into doing its bidding. This includes even the US. Do what China wants or else you get cut off from the critical supplies needed to keep your modern economy working. This is a strategic threat so great that even European powers have pledged some amount of support for Taiwan's continued independence. Luckily for Taiwan, though, the world's response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine has put a serious damper on China's ambition to conquer Taiwan. The unprecedented response from the West has shown China the lengths it's willing to go to in order to counter the aggression of authoritarian governments against free nations. Rumors swirl that China was actually planning to take military action this fall, but the Russian invasion of Ukraine completely derailed those plans. The last thing that China wants is to become a second global pariah, especially as its own economy faces some very serious internal disasters in the very near future. With Russia's invasion of Ukraine, most of the world's attention is on Eastern Europe and a potential confrontation between Russia and America. However, for those in the know, the real cause for concern is China's reaction to Russia's invasion. Rather than joining the world in condemning Russia, China has joined India in sidelining the seriousness of the invasion. Even worse, China now supports and helps spread Kremlin propaganda, suppressing the atrocities committed by Russia on Ukrainian civilians. Why is China so interested in helping Russia weather the global storm it unleashed? Because China has plans to launch its own invasion, and that puts it on a collision course with the United States of America. Not long ago, China's President Xi Jinping stated that China must reunite the breakaway island of Taiwan with the mainland. After World War II, Chinese nationalists continued their war against rebel communist forces, inevitably losing and being forced to flee the mainland for the island of Taiwan. In the years since, Taiwan has flourished into a vibrant democracy and a major global economy, but China refuses to acknowledge its independence and threatens military action and economic punishment against anyone who does. The problem with what would be an otherwise internal security matter for the Chinese is that the US has vowed to defend the fellow democracy against Chinese aggression. But why does China want Taiwan so bad? The reasons are numerous, but chief amongst them is because Taiwan represents a critical strategic vulnerability to China. Currently, China is hemmed in by what's known as the First Island Chain. This includes Taiwan, the northern Philippines, Borneo, Japan, and the Ryukyu Islands. Originally, the United States used the First Island Chain as a strategy to hem in the Soviet Union and its allies during the Cold War and deny them access to the Pacific in case of a war. To that end, it established strong relationships with all First Island Chain nations in partnerships that continue to this day. Now the Cold War is over, but a new Cold War has dawned, and China is America's new rival. With pro-US forces all along the First Island Chain, China will never be able to be a true global power, as its navy is too vulnerable to attack. Taking Taiwan will break the island chain in two and give China an island fortress from which to project power deep into the Pacific. But Taiwan is itself a critical threat to China's continued existence, or at least its continued existence under the dictatorship of the Chinese Communist Party. As a democratic state, Taiwan is an example to all of China of a different, better way of life, and many young Chinese people who are being increasingly exposed to foreign culture are growing tired of the oppressive rule of the CCP. For them, Taiwan is a beacon of hope for what China could look like rather than the nation of strict censorship, government intimidation, and very limited freedom that exists today. Despite erecting the Great Firewall in order to try and limit China's access to uncensored information, the influence from outside of China still reaches many of the country's citizens. This is a dire threat to the CCP, and thus neutralizing Taiwan and bringing it into the fold is but one step into ensuring its own survival. Next, it must topple the United States as the head of the global order so it can export its brand of authoritarianism around the globe. If it can control global culture, it doesn't need to fear rebellion within its own borders. Taking Taiwan is a strategic necessity if China is going to be able to challenge the influence of the US. If China is going to rise as the dominant superpower, or even just one that can compete with the United States, it must also be able to control the South Pacific. Currently, the United States Navy operates with impunity across the Pacific, and this puts critical Chinese trade routes in serious risk in case of war against the US. China imports the majority of its oil and relies on exports for much of its trade. If the US were to cut this lifeline off, China's economy would shrink significantly. Taking Taiwan and throwing the US out of the South Pacific thus ensures the safety and security of its trade and removes the dagger the US currently holds to China's throat in case of a war. But how exactly is China going to take on the world's most powerful military? Is it truly capable of challenging the US? And what do the numbers say? China's strategy to dethrone the US is to dominate what has come to be called the Fourth Industrial Revolution. The First Industrial Revolution was the use of steam power to mechanize production, allowing for never-before-seen productivity and efficiency. Not long after came the Second Industrial Revolution, heralded by cheap and abundant electricity, which allowed mass production on an epic scale. The Third Industrial Revolution introduced advanced electronics and information technology to automate production, and now we're building on this revolution for what will become known as the Fourth Industrial Revolution. This new revolution will be a digital revolution, with billions of people connected electronically and breakthroughs in artificial intelligence, robotics, 3D printing, quantum computing, and other fields. Much like the first factory to install a steam engine couldn't picture what the world would look like just 10 years from then, it's hard for us to predict what life will look like in the wake of the Fourth Industrial Revolution, though it is going to be the most revolutionary change in the affairs of human history. However, China is picturing the Fourth Industrial Revolution as the key to global hegemony, and it's investing billions into ensuring that it is the dominant power in the new world to come. China's strategy to dominate the world in the coming decades is a fusion of civilian and military application of technology. First, it's striving to be a leader in the technology department. ensuring that it is the first to create revolutionary technologies, thus enriching itself financially and creating dependency from the world on Chinese goods and services. Secondly, China is seeking to quickly turn new technological breakthroughs into usable military technologies that will allow it to surpass and dominate the US. China envisions future technologies as increasing the speed of future warfare, with future military success reliant on having forces that are mechanized, informatized, and intelligentized. According to the 2021 DoD's China Military Power Report, what this means is that China understands that victory is only possible with fully mechanized forces capable of being quickly moved into a conflict zone and supported with heavy firepower. However, those forces must also have access to a wealth of information via disseminated sensor systems, with this information shepherded through artificial intelligence that can give battlefield commanders exactly the information they need at the moment, while temporarily ignoring what they don't. Warfighters don't just need information, they need help sorting through it quickly, utilizing what's presently useful. If this sounds familiar to any of our viewers, it's because this is exactly the requirements the US military was investigating just a few years ago. China's Academy of Military Science has now established a mandate that the People's Liberation Army's warfighting theory and doctrine fully capitalize on disruptive technologies like AI and autonomous systems. Much like the US did in the First Cold War, China's focus is on building a modern state-of-the-art force. But today's force must be capable of accessing vast amounts of information and supported by AI that can execute automated tasks and assist with decision-making. China wants to teach machines how to wage war, so they can advise commanders in the thick of battle. Currently, the Chinese military is not very well networked, but those capabilities are increasing every year. It was only a few years ago that China first established a combined arms operations capability by establishing joint chains of command between its services in the same style as the United States. Now it seeks to match the US's networked capabilities by 2027 and then exceed them shortly after. But why is networking so important? Well, for one, it's what makes the US military so immediately lethal to opponents. Having the ability to network together ground, sea, air, and space assets allows for the swift exchange of information and gives a fighting force incredible adaptability and initiative on the battlefield. For an example of what happens when a modern force is not networked, all one has to do is look at the terrible losses being suffered by the Russians against a nation a fraction their size and capability. In the 21st century, the Russian military is still fighting battles like it was World War II, and the Ukrainians are making them suffer for it. In order to become a global leader in defense technology, China is taking a page straight out of the US's book by pursuing a strategy of civil-military fusion. What made the United States the superior power during the First Cold War was the close partnership between its military and civilian industry, which thrived in an environment of innovation. Such a partnership allowed for a swift adaptation of civilian technological breakthroughs into military assets and vice versa, with U.S. military technology breakthroughs quickly adapted into civilian technologies, making U.S. companies the most competitive in the world. Artificial intelligence, robotics, quantum computing, and biotechnology will shape not just the future of warfare but of human society itself. Achieving technological superiority and leadership in one or more of these areas will make China a true competitor to the United States. Achieving hegemony over all these critical areas will make China an insurmountable superpower. In order to achieve the goal, China is investing heavily in domestic innovation, but also in foreign investment to acquire technology, the recruitment of global talent, academic collaboration for research and development, and finally, China's strong point, military and industrial espionage. So how is the US preparing for this looming confrontation? First, as scary as China's ascension may seem, it's important to remember that it's still running uphill against America. Since the end of the First Cold War, the United States has influenced a new global order based on growing liberal democratic values. As we've seen in the global backlash against Russia, the New World Order frowns on the autocracies and abuses of the Old World. Vladimir Putin is a relic of the Old World with no place in modern society, and with a unified voice, the West has shouted him and his nation down, even going so far as to severely hurt themselves financially in order to punish Russian military aggression. This should be of grave concern to China's Xi Jinping and his Chinese Communist Party, as they too are relics of the Old World. The uprisings in Hong Kong that lasted for months are but a taste of the simmering tension just under the surface of Chinese society, and proof to the CCP of the corrupting influence of liberal Western values. Should China follow in Russia's footsteps and engage the world in hostility, it too will quickly find itself a pariah and outcast nation, effectively crippling any bid to become a global leader. This is why it's important for China to undermine Western values. The United States remains the world leader in technological innovation, despite mounting pressure from China and beyond. But the US is far ahead in one important area of technology: its ability to rapidly commercialize new and emerging technology on global markets. While Chinese technology grows in influence around the world, American companies are already globally established brands. China's modern problem is in convincing the world to buy more than just cheap manufactured goods from it. US commercial success is also due to its global culture domination. American brands are present in every country on Earth, but so is its culture. With one of the most rapidly evolving cultures in the world, US culture can be hard to define or nail down. But cultural export instruments such as Hollywood and Silicon Valley remain unassailable by their Chinese counterparts. For instance, while China may have developed the massively popular TikTok app, it wasn't until China pushed the app on the American marketplace and established relationships with American influencers that the app exploded in popularity. This is important because military and economic might only count for so much, and the US has used culture to bridge ideological gaps with partner nations around the world. Shared culture is the bedrock of strong strategic partnerships, and China has absolutely nothing of the like except for its partnership with North Korea. Shared culture and shared values are the reason the US remains the leader of the free world, and not because of its military being the strongest. Culture is another problem for China in its ongoing confrontation against the US and the rest of the West, because one of China's biggest problems is creating immigrant Chinese citizens. While over 1 million Chinese Americans reside in America, only a few thousand American Chinese have made their home in China. If China seeks to dominate future technologies by recruiting promising talent from around the world, it must be able to entice them, not just financially, but also with a desire to make China their new home. This is a massive problem for China versus the US, which remains one of the most attractive destinations for the world's most talented, due to not just economic opportunity, but its liberal democratic values. Finally, China must not just triumph over the US in future competition, but against the world, because outdoing the United States in one or more areas of technological innovation means little due to wide-reaching US alliances and partnerships. For America, a win by one of its allies is still a win for the US, while China must stand against the world completely alone. But how do the numbers stand today? What if a conflict broke out tomorrow between the two military heavyweights? Currently, the US is ranked as the world's #1 military power, with China in the #3 spot. However, this is debatable, as given Russia's extremely poor performance in Ukraine, we expect that China will climb to the #2 spot by next year, dethroning Russia, whom it seems derives most of its power from its ability to threaten with nuclear weapons. However, poor Russian performance should deeply concern China, because just like Russia, the Chinese military is also completely untested against modern capable foes. While Russian forces were more than adequate to crush uprisings in Aleppo and Chechnya, Russian superiority in numbers with equipment meant very little when it went up against Ukraine's Western-trained military. With China's last war being in Vietnam in the 70s, a conflict it ended up losing, China should be extremely concerned about facing the United States in battle, whom, unlike China, is thoroughly tested in modern combat. Much like Russia, China has lacked a robust training regimen for its military, with exercises typically being highly scripted and mostly for the benefit of visiting dignitaries. This culture has begun to change within China, but the nation is yet to match the robust training schedule of the US military. Realistic training, though, is not enough for the Chinese military, as it, also like Russia, must also contend with a legacy of corruption that has plagued its ranks for decades. President Xi Jinping's massive anti-corruption effort has produced great results, but the service must still contend with many officers who hold rank due to the time-honored Chinese tradition of gifting, wherein a junior official gifts a senior official in exchange for promotion. Currently, the Chinese military numbers at 2 million strong, dwarfing the US military in its 1.39 million strong force. This gives China a numbers advantage, but the US retains a great deal of force multipliers that don't just even the playing field but tip it decisively in its favor. Chief amongst these is a well-trained and well-equipped modern fighting force, while Chinese units vary widely in modernity. A hefty investment in precision weaponry, integrated forces, and superior sensor and tracking technologies make the US a lethal adversary even against a numerically superior foe. Reserves will play a critical role in any Sino-American conflict, but both sides are nearly evenly matched, with China having 510,000 ready reservists versus the US's 442,000. American reservists receive continual training of 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks out of the year, while training for Chinese reservists is improving but still spotty. This provides the US with a smaller reservist pool, but one that is more quickly capable of being introduced into the fight, while Chinese reservists require longer training periods or risk being thrown into combat completely unprepared. The American defense budget dwarfs China's at $770 billion versus China's $250 billion, but that's not telling the whole story. First, the US budget includes many costs for operations that would have nothing to do in case of war with China, such as funding for its 11 unified combatant commands spread out across the world. These combatant commands are responsible for general peacekeeping, and their presence is a globally stabilizing force. Without them, local conflicts would quickly sprout and spiral out of control. For example, without US Central Command, Iran would quickly seek to neutralize regional adversaries such as Saudi Arabia, causing massive global disruption of oil and other trade that passes through the region. Also, China does not count all of its military investments within its published budget report, cleverly hiding them within other non-military budgets. A large part of its nuclear modernization initiative, for example, is coming from funds outside of its official military budget. Lastly, because Chinese military equipment is sourced locally, it pays less for goods than the US does for its own equipment. That's because the standard of living is lower in China, with lower wages and less benefits, which means cheaper production costs. When compared by purchasing power parity, China's budget is significantly closer to the US's than a first glance would lead one to believe. Any war between the US and China would be waged at sea and air, making comparisons of the two sides' air forces and navies of utmost importance. The US operates an air fleet of 13,247 aircraft, easily dwarfing the Chinese air fleet of 3,285. When it comes to fighter aircraft, the two sides are close together, with the US having 1,957 fighters versus China's 1,200. American air mobility absolutely dwarfs Chinese mobility, though, with a transport fleet of 982 versus China's 286. Understandable given that the US faces conflicts far from its own shores, and China has little need to move its own forces significant distances. However, the massive advantage in airlift capability makes the US military much more flexible and agile than the Chinese military. Perhaps the most important distinction between the two air forces, though, is the number of special mission aircraft, with the US operating 774 versus China's 114. The US has placed a premium on equipping aircraft for everything from early warning to electronic and signals intelligence and anti-submarine warfare. The US dwarfs China in special mission capabilities, and it's part of what makes the US Air Force and Navy so lethal. Unless a confrontation between the US and China takes place on Taiwan, attack helicopters won't figure into the equation. However, if they do, the US outnumbers China with 910 versus China's 281. Numbers only tell part of the story, though, because the weapon systems used by both sides only further skew the advantage to the US. For air superiority, the US fields the F-15 Eagle and F-18 Super Hornet. A fleet of 187 operational F-22s are unmatched by China, who is yet to field its own fifth-generation fighter in any significant numbers. Adding to China's problem is the US's Rapid Raptor program, which aims to bring a sizable contingent of F-22s to any battle space in the world within 24 hours. China's competitor versus the Raptor is the J-20, which is equipped with inferior engines versus American planes, requiring the use of canards on the body of the plane. These canards and other obvious engineering flaws have led to defense analysts to conclude the J-20 has at best only a slightly smaller radar cross-section than a traditional fourth-generation fighter. In fact, India claims it has frequently observed and tracked Chinese J-20s with long-range radar. The rest of the Chinese Air Force varies widely in modernity, with a significant part of its Air Force still flying Cold War Russian-made or Chinese-licensed relics. While China would initially put its most modern fighters, such as the J-16, J-11s, and Su-30s, into the fight first, once those have been downed, it'll be increasingly reliant on older and older planes. Meanwhile, the United States doesn't just have a completely modern air fleet, but it's adding dozens of fifth-generation F-35s every year to its arsenal. The U.S. Air Force now has over 280 F-35s it can bring to the fight, with an additional 157 being added a year across the various services. In a war where air power would be decisive, the U.S. not only has the numbers advantage, but also the technological advantage. At sea, the U.S. Navy is outnumbered by the Chinese Navy, with 484 vessels versus China's 777. However, there are numbers once again only telling part of the story. The U.S. operates 11 aircraft carriers versus China's 2, and American aircraft carriers can bring over 800 aircraft into the fight versus China's grand total of 70. China's inflated naval numbers take into account things like missile boats, of which it has 84, while the U.S. only operates 10. In terms of tonnage, the U.S. Navy has over twice the hardware of the Chinese Navy, 4.6 million tons versus 2 million tons. A better way to compare the capabilities of the two fleets is to use a modern metric: battle force missiles. This is a count of the total number of missiles that a fleet has for use in combat before requiring resupply. This includes anti-ship missiles, land attack missiles, surface-to-air missiles, and torpedoes. Excluded from the count are short-range self-defense missiles like the US's SeaRAM. In 2019, the US Navy had 11,834 battle force missiles versus China's 5,250. The gap is narrowing, but not significantly, with China adding 15 more Type 55 cruisers with 112 missile cells and 6 torpedo tubes each throughout the 2020s. That will increase total battle force missiles by 1,770, just over half of what the US fields. Under the surface, China has the advantage with 71 submarines versus the US's 68. However, Chinese subs are mostly conventionally powered, while the US subs are all nuclear. That makes US submarines much more robust and able to operate for longer, but also decreases their vulnerability while operating. Chinese submarines are also an order of magnitude louder than US subs, with their Jin-class ballistic missile submarines having an acoustic signature of around 120 decibels, while American Virginia-class submarines have an acoustic signature of 95 decibels, which is just 5 decibels over background ocean noise at an average of 90 decibels. Submarine warfare has always been a weakness of China, and it looks to continue being so for the foreseeable future. While the US clearly has the naval advantage, it's important to remember that China can concentrate most of its fleet into a Pacific war against America, while the US has naval commitments around the world. Even if it were to recall the bulk of its fleet for action in the Pacific, such an act would take from days to weeks to mature into a sizable transit of combat power into the theater. Realistically speaking, the US Navy maintains an edge over China, but the two sides are very close to parity in terms of capabilities. Where the US advantage comes is in its ability to quickly replenish combat losses with well-trained crews and modern ships, while Chinese combat losses are not so easily replaced. Further honing America's advantage over China is its partnership with regional powers such as Japan and Australia, who would either allow the US to use their territory as bases of operation for war against China or very likely join the conflict itself. A new trilateral defense pact between the United Kingdom, the United States, and Australia is even seeing the US building nuclear attack submarines for Australia on the condition that in case of war, it will join in the effort against the People's Liberation Army, Navy, and Air Force. America's advantage in equipment and technology is sizable and looks set to remain so, but it's the US global partnerships and championing of liberal values that present the greatest likely insurmountable challenge for China. Until the Chinese Communist Party changes its core values, if it wishes to fight against America, it's picking a fight against most of the free world. For the last 10 years, one city in southwestern China has been slaughtering thousands of dogs for what's known as the Yulin Dog Meat Festival. During this 10-day celebration that begins on the summer solstice, dogs are killed by the thousands and eaten. Why does this festival occur? Is it a tradition with deep cultural roots? Are there health benefits to consuming dog meat? The answers to these questions are not what you might expect. Fair warning, this will not be an easy video to watch, as the nature of this festival is truly terrible. The Yulin Dog Meat Festival, also known as the Yulin Lychee and Dog Meat Festival, takes place in Yulin, a city located in the Guangxi Zhuang Autonomous Region of China. Leading up to the festival, thousands and thousands of dogs are rounded up from around the country to be transported to the city. The dogs are tightly packed into cages where they can barely move. They're then stacked up and transported via truck. The drive from parts of China back to Yulin can take days or even weeks. Oftentimes, the dogs in the middle of the crates suffocate to death, and many of them die from starvation or disease. This is truly an awful and inhumane way to treat dogs, or any animal for that matter. Every culture has its own unique practices. It's important to remember that something we may find uncomfortable might be deeply ingrained in another culture or belief system. So, is this true about the mass slaughter of dogs and consumption of their meat? Is this a practice that is deeply ingrained in Chinese culture? The answer is no, absolutely not. You may be thinking that perhaps this is a cultural tradition in the city of Yulin that dates back hundreds of years. If this is part of the history of the Yulin, that may explain why the festival occurs. Again, this is not the case either. In fact, the Yulin Dog Meat Festival only recently started about a decade ago. So why does this city in China bring thousands of dogs from around the country to a festival where they're killed and eaten if it's not an ancient cultural practice? 2 words: greed and money. The festival itself was launched in 2009 by the dog meat traders of Yulin as a way to boost their sales. That's right, the reason thousands of dogs are tortured and killed each year is so the dog meat traders of the country can increase their profit. Let that sink in for a moment. Now, to be fair, in the Western world, some companies do the exact same thing with cows and other livestock, but that's a story for another video. Prior to 2009, Yulin City had never had a dog meat festival before. And although dog meat consumption did happen, it was uncommon, and there certainly wasn't an established cultural tradition of dog eating in the city. Even though this is the case, the traders still claim that dog meat eating is ingrained in the Yulin City culture. This is a complete fabrication to try and justify the festival. If the premise behind the Yulin Dog Meat Festival was not already super messed up and corrupt, the way the dogs are procured brings things to a whole new level. Many of the dogs that are taken for the festival are strays and are just trying to survive in a world that refuses to help them. Others are actually stolen pets that still have their collars on when they're brought to Yulin. The dogs that survive the trip to the city are covered in urine and feces. Many also suffer from illnesses, dehydration, or heat stroke. While unloading the dogs from the trucks, the meat traders often throw the crates full of dogs down to the ground, causing even more pain and suffering to the animals. Originally, local officials endorsed and even encouraged the event as a way to attract tourists to the city. This did not happen, and instead it became a PR nightmare for the government. Animal rights organizations from within China and around the world condemned and protested the festival. However, there are still some people who flock to Yulin for the festival every year, which is one of the reasons why it's continued on. Cat meat, fresh lychee, fruits, and alcohol are also sold at the festival as well. Some people believe that consuming dog meat can bring good health and luck. And it's here that we need to make an important distinction. Eating dog meat is seen as taboo to the overwhelming majority of Chinese people. We will say this again because it's so important. Most Chinese people do not see eating dog meat as okay and find it just as offensive as other parts of the world. There are relatively few people in the scheme of things that continue to follow this tradition or consume dog meat at all. It's also important to remember that some people might not have had a choice. People in rural areas or in poverty may have no other source of protein besides dog meat. They may not even want to eat dog meat. But given the choice between dying of malnutrition or eating meat from a dog, what would you choose? There's plenty of support from Chinese people and others around the world to ban the consumption of dog meat. However, the Chinese government has been slow to enact change that would stop people from eating dog. But change is coming, even if it is slow. Since the coronavirus outbreak, the Chinese government has put a temporary ban on all trade and consumption of wild animals. In this case, that includes dogs. There are currently talks within the Chinese government of making this ban permanent, which would in effect end the rounding up and mass slaughter of dogs. Recently, the Agricultural Ministry of China has reclassified dogs as companion animals rather than livestock, as they were classified before. With the new classification and laws banning consumption of wild animals, dog meat should become illegal to eat in China by law. Although many activists believe this should have been done long ago, it's a step in the right direction. The Chinese people themselves have voiced concerns over the Yulin Dog Meat Festival and want to see it ended. They cite both animal welfare and food safety as the main concerns around the consumption of dog meat. The Chinese people have even taken to social media with hashtags including "refuse to eat companion animals" and "cancel Yulin Dog Meat Festival," which have been trending on China's social media platform Weibo. On top of all the internal pressure by the Chinese citizens, activist groups from around the world have been trying to ban the Yulin Dog Meat Festival for years. The activist group Bo-Ai Animal Protection Center in China's Sichuan province has been protesting to stop the festival for 8 years. Each year, they go to the Public Complaints and Proposals Administration of Guangxi Province to petition the stop of the festival and for the government to put a ban on slaughtering pets. The Bo-Ai Animal Protection Center, along with other international animal protection organizations such as No Dogs Left Behind, go to China and rescue dogs from being killed or sent to Yulin for the festival. The organization and their partners rescue dogs from illegal dog meat traders who have been stopped by the police. They then pair them with people looking to adopt a dog from other countries around the world. These organizations cannot rescue all of the dogs that are gathered to be killed and consumed, but they have saved hundreds of canine lives over the years. The Humane Society has supported grassroots campaigns in China to stop the Yulin Dog Meat Festival and have also raised awareness around the world of the atrocities that are occurring. Since their work began in 2010, the festival has slowly reduced in size, and there are more and more protests each year. In 2016, the Yulin police even erected a roadblock and checkpoints to stop trucks loaded with dogs from reaching the city. This was done a little late, and many trucks had already passed through, but having the local government and police making a tangible statement against the festival was a step in the right direction. In 2017, the Yulin government tried to impose a ban on the sale of all dog meat, but they succumbed to pressure from local dog traders who control a lot of money and power in the city. Instead of the ban, the government put restrictions on the number of dogs allowed to be sold in market stalls. They also made it illegal to make public displays of slaughtering the dogs. The government cracked down on the advertisement of dog meat being sold in restaurants as well. However, none of these restrictions helped combat the killing of dogs in back alleys or slaughterhouses just on the outskirts of the city. The dog meat trade is apparently so lucrative that people will find ways around the law just to participate in the Yulin festival. Now, if you thought everything you heard so far is bad, wait until you get through this next part. The Guangxi province, where Yulin is located, is in the top 5 worst affected areas for rabies in humans in China. This should come as no surprise at all, as the virus can be found in stray dogs. The rabies virus is incredibly deadly to all animals, including humans. If not treated before the onset of symptoms, it has one of the highest mortality rates of any virus on Earth at over 99%. This brings us to one of the biggest global problems of the Yulin Dog Meat Festival. The way that the dogs are treated and slaughtered is enough to make anyone condemn the festival. Due to the conditions in which the dogs are obtained, transported, and consumed, there's an even more important reason that this festival needs to be stopped, and it has to do with another global pandemic. COVID-19 has killed millions of people. We know that the virus jumped from another species to humans. Most scientists believe that this occurred in a live animal market, similar to the one that's held during the Yulin Dog Meat Festival. A video from the 2020 festival was taken showing vendors butchering the dogs without wearing face masks or any other form of protection. This is a recipe for disaster. It's been proven that the coronavirus cannot be spread from dogs to humans. However, that might not be true of a new virus in the future that could start the next global pandemic. This is why it's so vital to stop live animal markets that do not follow strict safety protocols. It's not just for the safety of the people in the market, but around the world as well. Change is slow. Dogs hold a special place in many people's hearts, which makes the thought of them being slaughtered and eaten unbearable to most of us. It's really important to remember that the vast majority of the Chinese people do not consume dog meat. It's also important to remember that the vast majority of Chinese people want to stop the Yulin Dog Meat Festival. The subset of people who are capturing and slaughtering thousands of dogs are not representative of the Chinese people as a whole, just like extremists in the country you live are not representative of you. The Yulin Dog Meat Festival should most definitely be put to a stop, for the dog's sake as well as us, for the safety of the entire world. Progress is being made, but since money and people's greeds are motivators for the festival, it'll be an uphill battle until the Chinese government bans the consumption of dog meat completely. The Taiping Rebellion was the most bloody civil war in history, and it was all started by a man who flunked a test, had a mental breakdown, and declared himself the brother of Jesus Christ. The Taiping Rebellion lasted for 14 years, devastated 17 different provinces, and cost the lives of between 20 and 30 million people. It changed the very course of history in China and set it on the trajectory to where it is today. In 1636, the Qing dynasty seized control of Manchuria in the northeast region of China. 8 years later, Qing became the imperial dynasty of the entire country. As the 19th century progressed, the nation found itself in trouble as famines, natural disasters, and foreign powers swept through its provinces. This caused the ruling elite to begin increasing taxes on the lower classes. Many poor peasants could no longer pay the exuberant sums their leaders were asking for and had to flee their land. Between 1839 and 1842, the First Opium War raged in China as the British Empire tried to resume the procurement and trade of opium after the Qing dynasty had banned the illicit substance. Opium was the British Empire's most profitable export to the Qing dynasty at the time, and for this reason, it was worth going to war over the ban. The British Navy decimated Chinese ships and soldiers, eventually defeating the Qing forces. The Treaty of Nanking was forced upon the Chinese, which led to an increase in foreign trade and the ceding of Hong Kong to Britain, as well as the continuation of the opium trade. As a result of the economic and political turmoil within their borders, extreme religious groups, organized crime syndicates, and secret societies began to thrive. The Chinese people looked for something new to put their faith in, and this led to small-scale conflicts arising throughout the country. While this was happening, the upper echelons of the Qing government were becoming more and more corrupt. Their already tenuous hold on the southern regions of the empire became weaker, and the seeds of rebellion were sown. In 1814, a man by the name of Hong Xiuwan was born in Huajian, Guangdong Province. He would become the catalyst that would throw the entire empire into chaos. Hong's family saw potential in him and pushed the boy to become a government official. From an early age, Hong's family made many sacrifices in order to provide him with the education and training he needed to pass the Confucian Civil Service examination. They belonged to a marginalized ethnic group called the Hakka, who had migrated to the southern regions of China in the 13th century. The Hakka had a distinct culture and language from the ruling Qing dynasty that was ethnically Manchurian and, like many in the empire who were not from the north, were looked down upon. Hong knew that passing the civil service test would bring wealth, honor, and prestige to the family. In 1827, Hong left his home in Hua County and traveled to the provincial capital of Guangzhou to take the exam. He failed and had to return home in shame. However, Hong refused to give up. He became a school teacher but continued to study for the test in his spare time. He made 2 more trips to the capital to take the test, but failed both times. After returning home with his 3rd failed attempt, Hong suffered a nervous breakdown in 1837, which was when things began to change. While he was slowly losing his mind, Hong had hallucinations. He claimed that two holy men visited him in his visions. One had a golden beard and the other only identified himself as an older brother. These holy men told Hong that he was consumed by evil spirits and that he must fight them in order to free his soul. In another divine vision, Hong found himself on a journey to a heavenly land in the east, where his very own father revealed to him that demons and the forces of evil were destroying humanity. In this hallucination, Hong held a sword, which he used to fight off the demons alongside his brother and eventually defeated the king of hell. After securing victory, Hong went to heaven, where he took a wife, and they had many children together. At the end of that dream, Hong was given the title of Heavenly King, Lord of the Kingly Way. After recovering from his mental breakdown, Hong went back to teaching but decided he would take the civil service exam one last time. In 1843, Hong sat down once again for the test, and once more, he failed. Consumed by despair, Hong consulted some literature that Christian missionaries had given him on one of his previous visits. As Hong read, he noticed several connections between what was in the Christian literature and his visions during his mental breakdown. He now believed the golden-bearded man must have been God, and the other brother was Jesus. To Hong, this meant that God was his true father, which meant that he was Jesus' younger brother. Hong Xiuquan believed that he was the second son of God, sent to China to save its people from demons and evil spirits that hid within the ruling Qing government. Hong immediately converted to Christianity and began a mission to spread his own teachings. Due to the industrialization and money flowing into China from trade, the population had nearly tripled since the Qing dynasty took over. Marginalized groups and oppressed people were already looking for an alternative to the struggles they faced under their current rulers. Many found an answer to their prayers and the hatred of the Qing in Hong's Taiping Heavenly Kingdom pedagogy, also called God-worshipping society. This new form of Christianity put very little emphasis on the New Testament and its teachings of forgiveness and treating others how you wish to be treated. Instead, the God-worshipping society was much more geared toward the wrath of God in the Old Testament. This meant that Hong demanded devotion and obedience from his followers, as he believed he was the second son of God. Proclivities such as prostitution, foot binding, and slavery were no longer allowed, and of course, smoking opium, adulterous behavior, gambling, and even the use of tobacco and alcohol were banned for the followers of the God-worshipping society. By 1847, Hong had been preaching his Taiping form of Christianity to his friends and people who entered his sphere of influence. In time, they began attracting more and more followers. A large population of peasants from the neighboring province of Guangxi, mostly people who identified as Hakka like Hong, found his teachings to be a much-needed respite from the oppressive laws coming out of Beijing. As Taiping Christianity attracted additional followers, new rules were put in place. An army began to take shape with strict regulations on how soldiers should act on and off the battlefield. Hong promised if the soldiers remained disciplined, fought fiercely until the end, and unquestioningly followed his teachings, they would have a prominent place in heaven. More peasants from across the region flocked to the quickly forming Taiping Heavenly Kingdom to hear Hong's teachings while his army continued to grow in size. Some truly believed in the message that Hong was spreading, but others just saw the movement as a way to resist the Qing rulers. By 1851, Hong had the beginnings of a revolution. His religious movement officially became the Taiping Tianguo, or Heavenly Kingdom of Great Peace, with Hong as both its spiritual and political leader. The Taiping Rebellion began in January in the southern province of Guangxi. An army of 10,000 men, led by Fang Yunshan and Wei Changhui, attacked Qing forces in Jintian, in present-day Guiping in Guangxi. The rebel army surprised the Qing forces, known as the Green Standard Army, and pushed them out of the region. When Qing units tried to launch a counterattack, it was successfully repelled by the Taiping army. With every battle its troops won, the Heavenly Kingdom's message was spread, and more people joined the Taiping Rebellion. In September of 1851, Taiping forces began to march further north as more Qing soldiers were sent to quell the uprising. They followed the Shang River into Hunan, where they attacked Changsha and Wuchang. Hong's forces made it to the Yangtze River by the following year, at which point the military leaders ordered their troops east, following the waterway until they reached Anqing and captured the city in February of 1853. But it wasn't just the Taiping military forces that were making progress. Throughout China, people were joining Hong's new Christian religion and becoming part of the Heavenly Kingdom. In it, men and women were equal, and the revolution began to dabble in communist ideologies by declaring property should be commonly held and distributed. This attracted a lot of poor farmers and peasants who had lost their land to the Qing and their absurd taxes. To ensure that the Taiping military always had a formidable force, anyone who joined the movement was considered a soldier of the kingdom. It didn't matter if they were a peasant with no money or someone of higher standing, everyone served. By the time the Qing rulers realized they had a serious uprising on their hands, it was too late. The Heavenly Kingdom gained millions of followers in only a few short years. It seemed that wherever the Taiping army went, they found more recruits, and with each converted municipality came more soldiers and resources for the Taiping rebels. In 1852, the Taiping leadership reached out to an unlikely ally. The Triad organizations had many cells in southern China, where the vast majority of the revolution supporters were located. The Triads found that the way the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom was organized itself was reminiscent of how they operated. This made the growing power in the south attractive to the Triads, and many joined the movement. By March of 1853, around 2 million people belonged to the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, which meant that the size of their army was massive. Taiping forces proceeded to Nanjing, where they lay siege to the city. The followers of Hong believed that the Manchus were demons, as this was what their leader had preached. Therefore, when they finally captured Nanjing, the Taiping army sentenced all of the men to death and cast the women out of the city, where they were burned alive. Nanjing was then renamed to Tianjing, which meant heavenly capital. On top of losing an administrative center, the capture of Nanjing was a huge blow to the prestige of the Qing upper class. They were losing territory after territory, and the city was an extremely important one in the region. The Taiping Rebellion gained even more support from the Chinese people, and it would only be a matter of time before the Heavenly Kingdom would come knocking on Beijing's front door, where the Qing capital was located. The Taiping military was full of zealots and fanatics, along with well-trained and level-headed soldiers. There was even entire divisions of women soldiers. Once Hong moved his rule to Tianjing, plans were laid out on how to conquer the northern cities. When the northern expedition was launched, the Taiping forces had a decent amount of success. They were able to conquer enough territory to create a buffer between their new capital and the Qing forces in the north. However, by the spring of 1855, things began to fall apart. The Taiping military retreated as Qing forces won battle after battle. Eventually, the Qing army managed to encircle Tianjing, but the heavenly capital was saved from conquest by the outbreak of the Second Opium War. This time, the Qing dynasty had to fight against both the British and the French. There was no way to continue a campaign against the Taiping uprising in the south and protect Beijing from foreign colonial powers in the north. So the battle against the Heavenly Kingdom was postponed temporarily. But not everything was going according to plan in the Heavenly City. Members of the Taiping leadership began disagreeing with one another. They questioned the decisions of their king, who was supposed to be a living god. For some time, Hong's mental state had been deteriorating, and it was not clear if he had the ability to rule the growing empire. Both Hong's advisors and the generals began vying for more power and ignoring the will of their king. Hong started to become paranoid, and so in 1856, he used his divine power and absolute authority to purge his court of anyone he suspected of conspiring to overthrow him. Hundreds of people who were once close to the king were sentenced to death. At the same time the Taiping leadership was being slaughtered, a Qing general by the name of Zhang Guofan led a relatively small force made up of local recruits called the Hunan or Zhang Army to fend off the onslaught of Taiping forces in western China. Zhang was able to push the rebellion forces back and eventually retook Wuchang in the middle of the country. The Zhang army then managed to secure all of Jiangxi by September of 1858. In 1859, the unthinkable happened. Someone other than Hong Xiuquan was rising to power in the Heavenly Kingdom. In fact, the man who looked to be vying for power was Hong Xiuquan's cousin, Hong Rengan. Rengan had been one of his earliest recruits and wanted to change the goals of the movement. Rengan's dream was to move the Taiping Revolution toward a similar system to Western democracy. He planned to implement education reforms and open all of Taiping's territory to trade from foreign powers. These new ideas did not sit well with many of the revolutionaries, and Hong Xiuquan maintained power while his cousin resorted to promoting his ideas to smaller groups of people in the empire. However, it was becoming increasingly clear to those who were in the Taiping government that their king was starting to lose his mind and would not be able to lead the revolution forever. Eventually, all he would be was a figurehead that the populace could worship. In 1860, Qing forces again needed to come to an agreement with European powers to end the Second Opium War. They could not continue fighting Britain and France and get the Taiping Rebellion under control. What the Qing leadership found was that the revolution was causing problems for the European opium trade, and a tentative alliance was formed between the Qing and the Europeans. This collaboration allowed the Qing to modernize their military and improve their tactics. In May of that year, Taiping forces finally defeated the Qing army that had been laying siege to Tianjin on and off for years. This provided Taiping forces with access to southern Jiangsu and Zhejiang provinces. These areas were some of the wealthiest in all of the Qing Empire. Unfortunately for the rebellion, as the Taiping forces were advancing further east, Zhang's forces were proceeding down the Yangtze River, deeper into Taiping-held territory. In order to bolster their strength and get a better foothold in the region, the Taiping military tried to take Shanghai in June 1961. The siege would last for 15 months, but the Heavenly Kingdom's forces would be continuously repelled by the now Western-trained, ever-victorious army, commanded by the American adventurer Frederick Townsend Ward. Zhang's Shang army was also gathering support at this time, as many Confucianist majority of China felt alienated by the radical Christian theology that drove the Taiping Rebellion. Later that year, Zhang's army captured Anqing as they proceeded along the Yangtze River and continued to march toward Tianjin. This was done with the help of the Royal Navy, which had blockaded vital waterways and ports that the Taiping relied on. The Taiping military launched a final expedition to the east to combat the encroaching Qing forces. They easily captured several cities but never successfully took Shanghai. In May of 1862, Zhang's Xiang army reached Taijing. They were outnumbered but with superior commanders. The Qing force was able to maintain its position. Hong Xiuquan told the people in the capital that God would defend the heavenly city and protect everyone in it. However, 2 years into the siege, Hong died of poisoning. It was not clear if he took his own life or ate food that made him sick. The population quickly began to lose hope now that their god king was dead. Some 100,000 Tianjin citizens died fighting or taking their own lives. For many, this was preferable to being captured by the enemy when Tianjin fell in July of 1864. The Qing soldiers located Hong's body, cremated it, loaded the ashes into a cannon, and fired it across the landscape to ensure the rebellion's leader would not have a resting place or an altar for his followers to visit. 4 months before Hong died, he abdicated the throne so that his 15-year-old son, Hong Tianguifu, could become the new king of the Heavenly Kingdom. However, he had very little power, and when Qing seized the capital city, the rebellion began to fall apart. Even though Tianguifu and some of his advisors managed to escape the city initially, they were caught soon afterward and executed. Hundreds of thousands of Taiping troops continued to fight across the country for the next several months. It's estimated that there were at least 250,000 Taiping soldiers in the region of Jiangxi and Fujian alone. However, each force was eventually defeated by the European-backed Qing military, and the Taiping Rebellion was finally in its death throes. More rural regions did continue to fight on as they refused to return to the oppressive rule of Beijing and the Qing dynasty. Revolts in northern Zhejiang, the highlands of Jiangxi, and Fujian continued for some time but were eventually crushed. The last Taiping holdouts were located in Guangdong, where a final Taiping loyalist by the name of Wang Haiyang continued fighting until his defeat on January 29, 1866. By 1868, all reminiscences of the Taiping Rebellion were wiped from the borders of China. But the suffering was not over. The Qing dynasty had gone into decline, and in the early 20th century, China experienced large-scale civil unrest. The government went through several iterations before the Chinese Communist Revolution, which led to the rise of the People's Republic of China in 1949, led by Mao Zedong. The aftermath of the Taiping Rebellion was a tragic one. The conflict spilled over from China into Vietnam. During the 1860s, Wu Lingyun, a Shuang Taiping leader, proclaimed himself King of Dingling in the regions along the Chinese-Vietnamese border. Wu was killed and his son took over shortly after, but eventually he had to flee the Qing in China and was executed in Vietnam for his father's previous conquest. The Taiping Rebellion resulted in some long-lasting changes to Chinese culture. The language was simplified, along with more equality developing between men and women. The Taiping Rebellion also had undertones of communism, which would set the stage for the form of government adopted by the People's Republic of China. However, it is worth mentioning that the authoritarian form of communism that China has today is a bastardization of true communism, which the Taiping Rebellion tried to establish. By the end of the rebellion, the death toll likely reached between 20 and 30 million people. Some scholars suggest that as many as 100 million civilians and soldiers died because of the Civil War. It's interesting to note that most of the death came from plague and famine, not from soldiers slaughtering each other. However, even conservative estimates of lives lost during the Taiping Rebellion make this the deadliest civil war in all of human history. A small Vietnamese fishing boat putters along in the dark. A storm has knocked down its radio antenna, and the cheap GPS unit the poor fishermen used to navigate has long ago stopped functioning. They're sailing using the stars now, the way their ancient forefathers did, and cast a westerly course in hopes of hitting the mainland. Suddenly, a bright spotlight blasts the fishermen in the face, completely blinding them. A massive Chinese destroyer quickly steams in close to the small fishing vessel. In the dark, the fishermen hadn't even noticed it approaching. Two Zodiac craft full of Chinese Marines are tearing through the water at high speeds toward the fishermen, the machine guns at the bow of each boat aimed at them. With frenzied shouts, the Chinese Marines board the craft and push the fishermen to the floor, zip-tying their hands behind their back. They'll be arrested, interrogated, temporarily held, and eventually released back to their native Vietnam. Their ship will be pulled apart piece by piece in search of secret spy gear. The fishermen will never see it in one piece again. Their crime? Accidentally sailing too close to one of China's growing number of illegal military fortifications in the South China Sea. The controversy began back in 2014 as China began to implement a plan to aggressively expand its military power and national sovereignty into the South China Sea. With the world's largest fleet of dredging craft, China began to build up 7 isolated reefs in the South China Sea, hundreds of miles from mainland China. The massive ships sucked in sand from the bottom of the ocean and stored it in huge tanks, then released it onto the small beaches of these tiny reefs, gradually building up the reefs until it had turned into islands. The move was immediately met by international condemnation. Vietnam, the Philippines, and other neighbors have their own far more legitimate claims to the region, which China has largely ignored. Citing a map drawn by the Chinese national government in the 1940s and dubious claims about sea exploration during the Ming Dynasty, China maintains that a 9-dash line extending all the way to Malaysia in the south, the Philippines in the east, and running along Vietnam's coast is China's true national claim to the ocean. This 9-dash line encompasses nearly the entire South China Sea and ignores the economic exclusion zones of neighboring nations as set by international law. Along with its army of dredgers, China also developed a massive Coast Guard fleet dedicated to the intimidation and harassment of other nations' ships. Armed with water cannons, Chinese ships ran off Vietnamese, Malaysian, and Filipino fishing vessels, while escorting its own fishing fleets to some of the world's richest fishing grounds. In an extremely bold and controversial move, China even moved an oil drilling platform directly into Vietnamese waters and began extracting petroleum and natural gas from the site. China's strategy was twofold. First, it would build up artificial reefs throughout the Paracel and Spratly Islands, turning them into solid ground and moving Chinese military troops there. Under international law, a country can't claim waters around an island feature unless that island has a permanent presence of the nation's inhabitants. This is also the reason why, to counter Chinese claims, the Filipino Navy regularly maintains soldiers stationed on old shipwrecks around reefs in the Spratly Islands. These soldiers rely on resupply from Filipino Navy ships for everything from batteries to food and water. Yet almost immediately, the Chinese Navy began to blockade Filipino Navy ships from reaching those soldiers in an attempt to starve them out of their positions. China's second part to its strategy, to illegally claim the South China Sea, was to build up a large enough military presence that it simply wouldn't be possible to remove China from the area. This would be tricky, though, as it requires massive construction efforts over many years until the islands were big enough to hold large amounts of military equipment. Vietnam and its neighbors in the South China Sea are too weak militarily to do anything about China's expansion, so they filed a complaint with the UN. In 2016, a ruling from the International Court at The Hague found China's claims and island reclamation abilities to be illegal and ordered a halt to further expansion on the contested reefs. China immediately ignored that order, and the world did nothing to enforce it. The real question is, why is China burning global goodwill for the sake of a few island bases? The answer to that is threefold, and the first part of the answer is economic. The South China Sea holds 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas and 11 billion barrels of oil in reserves, with much more believed to lie undiscovered. The surplus of energy is worth trillions to the Chinese, and along with its oil and natural gas, the region is also home to some of the world's remaining fertile fishing grounds, worth billions in revenue. By edging out all other nations from their own legitimate claims to the region, China has positioned itself to amass a staggering wealth, paying out over decades to come. Secondly, China has long chafed at the United States' status as a regional security partner with its neighbors. One of China's greatest ambitions is to throw the U.S. out of the South Pacific, and thus bully its neighbors into its own political sphere of influence, no different than the Soviet Union and its Iron Curtain post-World War II. Today, the South China Sea is the world's greatest trade artery, with hundreds of billions of dollars worth of trade moving through the region every year. The U.S. Navy guarantees freedom of navigation for all vessels in the region. Yet, if China could successfully push the U.S. out of the region, all of that trade from nations around the world would be subject to China's authority. Any nations China finds itself displeased with could soon find their merchant vessels harassed or even outright barred from traversing the region, a serious concern for any country that doesn't want to be subject to the Chinese Communist Party's will. The plan is working. As China continues to build military infrastructure across the reclaimed islands, it'll become increasingly unrealistic for the United States Navy to remain in the region and expect to survive in case of war. With U.S. forces effectively pushed out of the region, China's neighbors will have no choice but to deal with China. Something Vietnam is so afraid of, it recently held discussions with U.S. diplomats about potential cooperation with the U.S. military. The third answer to China's wish to establish itself in the South China Sea is to protect itself from the military power of the U.S. China understands that it cannot challenge the U.S. Navy in a stand-up fight, even with a portion of the U.S. naval forces stationed in the Atlantic. However, the buildup of military facilities around the South China Sea has officially put China in a position to not just challenge the U.S. Navy, but to prevent it from operating in the region outright in the case of war. China has built just under 100 bunkers for fighter aircraft across its 7 artificial islands and invested billions in anti-ship and anti-aircraft missile batteries, long-range radar, signals intelligence equipment, and even missile defense batteries. Sea Whiz gun mounts protect Chinese radar and missile installations, and several of the runways China built are large enough to host Chinese bombers loaded with long-range anti-ship missiles. All of this firepower has effectively made it impossible for the U.S. to intervene in the region at the outset of war and push back U.S. forces to Guam if they hope to avoid immediate destruction. While eventually U.S. firepower could level all 7 of these island bases, the investment would be extremely costly in terms of missiles and hardware both. Each base would need approximately 100 missiles to completely neutralize, and a significant number of those missiles would be knocked out by Chinese missile defenses. High-altitude airstrikes would be a far better option, but even B-2 stealth bombers would find the environment challenging to operate in, and non-stealth aircraft would have practically zero survivability. What's more, all the firepower needed to neutralize these island bases and open up the South China Sea again is much more desperately needed further up north, in defense of Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. All of these which no doubt find themselves under threat from Chinese forces should a regional war break out. The only American hardware that could operate within the contested sea space would be American submarines. Chinese anti-submarine capabilities are still lacking. However, these subs would be focused on sinking Chinese ships and subs and wouldn't be risked to just undertake largely ineffective missile attacks against the island fortresses. China's successful strategy to claim the South China Sea has been an incremental war of inches, with President Xi Jinping correctly guessing that the United States would never risk a full-blown war as long as China's aggressive expansion was done very incrementally, just a few inches at a time. Now, in 2021, not only has China won the war of inches, but guaranteed that in a future US-Sino conflict, freeing the South China Sea once more will require incredible amounts of American blood and resources both, a price we may simply not be willing to pay. In the end, it's the rest of the world that ends up losing as China wins big.
China and Japan are 2 countries that have been culturally intertwined from as early as 400 AD. This relationship led to Japan adopting the Chinese writing system, the religion of Buddhism, similar political systems, as well as developing in matters of food, fashion, law, and more under the influence of China. Although the countries are currently at peace, relations have remained somewhat tense over the last century. Today, we'll compare the 2 nations in a hypothetical military matchup in this episode of the infographic show, China vs. Japan. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell button so that you can be part of our notification squad. The USA has the world's highest GDP of around $18.5 trillion. It's followed by China with a nominal GDP of $11.8 trillion, and then Japan with a GDP of around $4.8 trillion. The European Union would take second place, but the EU is a combination of 28 states. While China has experienced economic prosperity in recent years, its per capita GDP ranks low, globally in 70th place, at around $8,000, with Japan's per capita GDP much higher at around $39,000. There is certainly less money to go around in China, as it has the world's largest population of 1.38 billion people, compared to Japan's 126+ million population. In terms of military spending, China ranks third behind Russia and the military-minded USA, with a defense budget of around $147 billion, which is 2.1% of its GDP. Japan sits in 7th place on this list, with a $43 billion defense budget, which is 0.9% of its GDP. It's also worth mentioning here that military pundits often state China spends much more on its military than the number that is reported, although China's finance minister denied this secrecy in 2017, saying, "Let me be very clear, there is no such thing as opacity in China's military spending." While Japan is regarded as being a military powerhouse, its number of military personnel is actually quite small and very much inferior to the number of personnel the Chinese employ. Japan has around 250,000 active military personnel, with another 57,900 people acting as reserve personnel. China, on the other hand, has a massive 2,335,000 active frontline personnel and 2,300,000 active reserve personnel and paramilitary forces. Japan's personal numbers may be small, but it's protected with some of the world's best military equipment. This includes 678 tanks, 2,850 armored fighting vehicles, 202 self-propelled guns, 500 towed artillery, and 99 multiple launch rocket systems. Its large fleet of land artillery includes 2 machines often on the list of the world's most advanced tanks, those being the Japanese-made Type 10 main battle tank and Type 90 main battle tank. China, however, outguns Japan considerably with a total of 9,150 tanks, 4,788 AFVs, 1,710 SPGs, 6,246 towed artillery, and 177 MLRSs. China's Type 99 main battle tank is also highly rated, while the country also claims to have developed the most advanced tank in the world in its VT-4. China is not alone in making such boastful claims, with the USA and Russia also stating they have the best tanks in the M1A2 Abrams and the T-14 Armata, respectively. The VT-4 is as much a Chinese war machine as it is a profitable export, with Thailand placing a big order of the tanks and other countries showing interest in buying. Both countries have strong air forces, with China owning around 2,900 plus aircraft and 206 attack helicopters. Japan has around 1,590 aircraft and 119 attack helicopters. In terms of strength, China's aerial piece de résistance is its new Chengdu J-20 stealth fighter, which the Air Force and some aviation experts have stated can match America's highly advanced Lockheed Martin F-22 Raptor and F-35. China is also the only country to have bought the Russian Beasts of the Skies, the Sukhoi Su-35 multi-purpose fighter. If you've seen our shows on these aircraft, you'll know the Su-35 alone is an impeccable piece of engineering. Japan would be hard pushed to equal such aerial military might, but the country is no slouch when it comes to aircraft. Japan is said to have created a veritable equal to China's J-20, having joined the stealth leagues with its own Mitsubishi X-2. Japan has some formidable combat aircraft in its homemade Mitsubishi F-2, as well as American-made F-4 Phantom IIs and F-15 Eagles. The country is also the proud owner of the USA's highly touted F-35 Lightning II. Japan currently has one of these aircraft, but another 42 have been ordered. With this in mind, the two countries seem to be fairly evenly matched in terms of Air Force equipment, with Japanese imports being a major factor. As far as naval power is concerned, a matter of significance given the history of naval invasions and the fact that the countries are separated by a stretch of water, both countries are credited with having very strong navies, although most analysts rank China above Japan. The People's Liberation Army Navy is said to have grown from a fairly weak outfit consisting of old ships to a formidable foe due to massive injections of money since China's economic boom. The Navy not only has well over 100,000 personnel, but has a large fleet of ships. This includes 1 aircraft carrier, 35 destroyers, 51 frigates, 35 corvettes, 31 mine warfare, 3 amphibious transports, 8 nuclear attack submarines, and around 50 conventional attack submarines. By comparison, the Japanese Navy consists of around 114 ships and 45,800 personnel, and according to nationalinterest.org, its fleet of 17 submarines is as good as any submarine fleet in the world. In total, Japan has 3 aircraft carriers, 43 destroyers, 6 coastal defense craft, 0 frigates, 0 corvettes, and 25 mine warfare. A matter of importance is each country's nuclear capabilities. Japan doesn't have any nuclear weapons, although it is protected by the United States under the nuclear umbrella. The country is well known for its highly advanced industries and technology, and there is no doubt that it could develop its own nuclear weapons given its nuclear energy infrastructure. This has so far not happened due to a non-nuclear weapons policy, although being positioned so close to North Korea, many Japanese politicians and military officials have called for a change in nuclear weapons policy. China, on the other hand, is one of 9 nations with nuclear weapons with a considerable arsenal of around 260 warheads. Its first nuclear test was in 1964. The number of weapons, however, and China's development of nuclear weapons has been a matter of wide speculation. For instance, a Georgetown University study claimed that China's nuclear weapons arsenal is not in the hundreds, but possibly 3,000. The study claimed the weapons were hidden in secret underground tunnels. The prospect of any kind of conflict involving these weapons of mass destruction, however, is highly unlikely. We cannot forget that almost every single tank, aircraft, or naval unit needs fuel to operate. China currently consumes approximately 12 million barrels of oil a day, but it only produces about 4 million barrels daily. That said, it does have 25 billion barrels in reserves. Japan, on the other hand, consumes 4.15 million barrels of oil a day, but it only produces a meager 3,900 barrels daily. Worse yet, it only has 44 million barrels of oil in reserves. So, who do you think has a stronger military, China or Japan? Let us know why in the comments. And be sure to check out our military comparisons playlist. Thanks for watching, and as always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. See you next time!